Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is David Reeves. I'm 31 years old, and this happened in April of 2024. When I decided to hike around Standing Indian Mountain in the Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina. I am not a military veteran or a survival specialist or anything like that. I work as an IT contractor and spend most of my life in front of a screen, writing code and dealing with user complaints. That's exactly why I needed to take the trip. I was burned out, restless, and tired of the city. I wanted to disappear into the wilderness with my German Shepherd, Max, for a long weekend, hoping to come out the other side a little clearer, a little calmer, and with a renewed sense of appreciation for life. I arrived at the Standing Indian Campground parking area on a Thursday morning, having called off work for a few days. It was uncommonly warm for April, and the sky was the color of washed-out denim. I'd been here once before, years ago, only for a short hike near the base of the mountain. This time, I planned a loop that would take us around several ridge lines, culminating at the summit of Standing Indian Mountain. The place drew its name from a Cherokee legend. The rough story was that a sentry had been turned to stone by a curse, or something like that. I'd read bits and pieces online. They left me with the sense that the mountain was both beautiful and haunted somehow. It intrigued me. After parking, I took inventory of all my gear. A small pop-up tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, a satellite phone, a fancy device I rarely used, a standard cell phone, a paper topo map, compass, water purifier, freeze-dried meals, bear canister, first aid kit, the usual. Everything was packed carefully. Max was on his leash while I made sure my boots were laced tight. He's a 5-year-old German Shepherd, large for his breed and exceptionally well-trained, maybe my only real asset out in the wild. Once I was settled, I tossed on my backpack, said a silent prayer that I wasn't forgetting anything, and started up the trail. Standing Indian Mountain is a part of Nantahala National Forest, which is a gorgeous place. Thick forests, rushing streams, and if you go high enough, rolling ridgelines that stretch out as far as you can see. The plan was to hike in a southwestern loop, camping along the way, and eventually circle back to the parking area by Sunday. It didn't sound too difficult, but the area is vast, and the weather can change quickly. The first few hours were idyllic, practically the definition of a perfect getaway. Max padded along happily, tail wagging, tongue lolling. He'd stop every so often to investigate some smell in the underbrush, or stare up at the branches as though expecting to see a squirrel. The forest canopy shivered in a gentle breeze, scattering patterns of sunlight over the trail. It was quiet, aside from bird calls and the crunch of my boots on the damp soil. This was everything I wanted. Quiet, calm, a chance to breathe in fresh air and forget about the pressure of deadlines and the flickering glare of a computer screen. We reached our first campsite by late afternoon. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat area beneath a few hardwoods near a fast-moving creek. This was a few miles off the main loop, but I'd heard from other hikers online that it was a great place to set up for the night. The trees stood tall. The creek offered easy water access, and there was enough downed wood to build a decent fire ring. I took my time pitching the tent, fed Max, and listened to the wind in the branches above us. The early evening sun cast long shadows. Everything was tinted gold as I started the campfire. That's when the first odd thing happened. I had my phone in airplane mode to preserve battery. I switched it on briefly to check the time. My watch was old and sometimes lost a few minutes. The phone read 5:47 p.m., which seemed about right, but I blinked at the battery indicator. It had gone from near 80% that morning to 2%, then flickered to 1% and died in a matter of seconds. I just stared at the black screen, perplexed. My phone had never done that before. I'd charged it fully in the car on the drive here. Yes, it was a few years old, but draining from 80% to dead in one day with airplane mode on was bizarre. At the time, I shrugged it off. I told myself maybe the battery was failing. Luckily, I had my small satellite phone if I needed an emergency call, but that also meant I'd have no easy pictures or GPS. Fine, I thought. I had a real compass and a paper map for a reason. Besides, I'd come here to unplug anyway. The sky took on that strange, dusky haze where the sun was going down, but it felt too early. The shadows were a bit too long. I decided to eat an early dinner, one of those freeze-dried pasta packs, while I still had good light. Max sat quietly, ears perked, scanning the trees. When I poured water into his collapsible bowl, he drank with slow, careful laps, then looked over his shoulder. At the time, I assumed he smelled deer or some other wildlife. Still, it made me feel uneasy for reasons I couldn't pin down. Max is typically relaxed while camping, excited even, but I noticed his hackles raising ever so slightly. The night came faster than usual. By 7 p.m., it looked and felt like 9 o'clock. I tried not to dwell on it. The mountains can change light conditions drastically, especially in narrow valleys or under thick forest canopies. The campfire was flickering in front of me. Max scooted close, and I patted his back absently as I stared into the flames. The logs crackled and spat, flaring with bright sparks that spiraled up into the darkening sky. At some point, I needed more firewood. I got up and walked a small circle around camp to gather fallen sticks. I found just enough to last a few hours, then turned back. When I got back to the fire, I could have sworn the flames had turned a deep bluish hue in the center, almost like the hottest part of a propane burner. For a moment, I worried maybe I'd used some chemically treated wood, but these sticks were obviously just dried branches from the forest floor. I watched the flames swirl. They flickered between normal orange and that unnerving blue, almost like they were breathing in tandem with the wind. Then they settled into a normal, dull orange glow. I sat down again, deciding it was just an odd patch of resin or sap that burned. It was a small, harmless strangeness. Night deepened, and it got cold quickly. Max and I retreated into the tent. I zipped us both in, with him curled protectively near my feet. He was my alarm system, after all. I dozed off, lulled by the roar of the creek and the faint hiss of the dying fire outside. I slept fitfully, dreaming of flickering lights and tall shapes gliding through the woods. Occasionally, I half woke and saw the tent walls shifting oddly, like they were breathing. I tried to brush the feeling off as exhaustion. Once, I thought I heard a whisper outside, but then realized it was probably the creek or the wind. Still, there was a moment, just before I slipped back to sleep, where I swear I heard my name. David? So soft I couldn't be sure. When I listened harder, I heard nothing. Eventually, I fell into deeper sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I found myself lying outside the tent's open flap. My sleeping bag was half in, half out. My clothes were damp, my body stiff from the chill. As soon as I stirred, Max came trotting over, whining with concern. I jerked upright, disoriented with a pounding in my head like a hangover. I sat there for a moment, stunned. I never sleepwalk, not once in my life. At least, not to my knowledge. The tent flap was unzipped from the inside like I had opened it in my sleep. It must have dropped to near freezing temperatures overnight. I checked my watch. The hands had stopped around 2:14 a.m. The thing was old, but it shouldn't have just stopped like that. The second hand was ticking the night before. It wasn't ticking now. Maybe the battery in the watch was failing, I told myself. That, combined with the phone battery draining, just felt like bad luck. Still, my nerves were jangled. I scooted back into the tent, feeling the dewy nylon floor, and tested the zipper. It moved smoothly, no sign of it being torn or forced. I rubbed my face and tried to steady my breathing. The air tasted almost metallic, like the aftermath of a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear, no sign of overnight rain. I zipped the tent closed and rubbed Max's head, trying to calm him. He kept sniffing at my clothes, whimpering and pacing. Could he have nudged the zipper open? Possibly, but he'd never done that before, and I had latched the inside. As soon as I pulled myself together, I walked over to where I'd stored my backpack. The bag was nowhere to be seen. My heart hammered. Everything was in there: food, gear, the sat phone, basically all my supplies. I scanned the area. I hadn't left the bag inside the tent with me, but near a tree trunk a few feet away from the fire ring so I could have room to sleep. Yet now, that entire area looked slightly different. The brush was bent in the wrong direction, as if someone or something had dragged the pack off. Panicking, I wasted no time searching. I combed a circle around the campsite. After maybe 10 anxious minutes, I heard Max barking. He'd found the backpack, partially unzipped, propped against a dead stump at the edge of a patch of ferns. It was about 30 feet from camp in a direction I'm certain I didn't go the night before. The hair on my arm stood up as I approached. The pack was open, but nothing was missing. Everything was just out of order. My freeze-dried meals were scattered. My water purifier was lodged halfway into a side pouch. The satellite phone sat in the main compartment but turned on, showing a blinking error screen. I stared at it in confusion, trying to think of a rational explanation. A raccoon or a bear rummaging around, perhaps. Bears can be clever with zippers, but they usually tear right through a pack, and no prints around the stump indicated anything that large. Coyotes might have dragged it, but they wouldn't have fiddled with it in a neat way. This looked methodical. The gear was in perfect shape, just arranged oddly. Swallowing my fear, I called Max to me, patted him for reassurance, and told myself it was just one of those weird things that happen in the wild. Maybe it was a person playing a prank. A weird, malicious sort of prank, but still. I checked my surroundings carefully, scanning for footprints, but the ground was littered with leaf duff and made it hard to see impressions. I found no fresh tracks. Stomach twisting, I resolved that it would be best to move on. I'd continue to the next campsite on my map, a known shelter area near a place called the Standing Indian Shelter, about 6 miles away. If anything else seemed off, I would bail on this trip. I might not have had a working phone, but I had the satellite device, assuming it wasn't glitched out permanently, and I could push toward a more populated trail if necessary. I spent half an hour reorganizing my gear and checking supplies. The freeze-dried meals looked fine. My water purifier was intact. Then I noticed something else. The map I'd folded in half was now missing from the backpack's top compartment, but I found it at the bottom. Not unusual in itself, but it was dripping wet. Water soaked into the paper so thoroughly that parts of it tore like tissue. The edges had black smudges, almost like mold or soot. Maybe it had been dragged through the creek. I tried to smooth out the map to salvage what I could. It was borderline illegible in places. The compass, which I'd always kept in the same compartment as the map, was gone. After a frantic few minutes searching every pocket, I discovered it buried in a side mesh pouch. The glass face was cracked, and the dial was stuck pointing east. When I picked it up, the needle slid in circles, spinning freely, never stopping in any one direction. My frustration was overshadowed by worry. I'd never encountered anything so bizarre on the trail, and I'd done my share of backcountry hikes. I stuffed the useless compass back into my pack and whistled to Max. We needed to get moving. The route was fairly straightforward if I followed the main trail, so the map might not be essential. I told myself that whatever weirdness had happened was behind me. We set off. The sun was higher now, and the forest sparkled with morning dew. The day's warmth was slow to take hold, but I was grateful for the crisp air. My hangover-like headache lingered, but I tried to push through. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of someone walking parallel to me, but every time I turned, there was nothing. Max was jumpy, ears pivoting, occasionally giving a low growl. By mid-morning, I reached a tributary of the main creek, forcing me to rock hop across a shallow spot. I recognized this crossing from an online trip report, so I knew I was on course, which eased my mind a bit. But the sense of being watched never fully left me. The trail soon forked. A battered sign pointed left, indicating Standing Indian Shelter, 3.5 miles. I turned that way. A weird wave of dizziness hit me, causing me to stumble. I checked my watch out of habit, but of course it had stopped working the night before. Staring at that frozen time, 2:14 a.m., made me queasy, so I shoved my wrist down and kept walking. Half an hour of steady hiking later, I passed a vantage point where you could see the ridgeline of Standing Indian Mountain. That alone told me I was still heading the right way. Yet, as I walked, the sun kept shifting overhead like it was on fast forward. Shadows extended in odd ways, then snapped back short. At one point, I got a glimpse of my phone's reflection in the black screen, and behind me, in that reflection, I thought I saw a silhouette that looked exactly like me, about 15 yards back, just out of focus. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing there. I was starting to wonder if something had contaminated my water supply, maybe making me hallucinate. My water purifier was a good brand, though. Max let out a sudden bark, hair standing on end, as if to confirm my concerns. "We're okay, buddy," I said quietly, not believing it myself. Before long, I realized I should have been nearing the shelter, but the trail seemed to stretch on infinitely. What was supposed to be just a few miles felt like 8. Another vantage point came up, nearly identical to the one I'd passed earlier. It was as if I had looped back. The trees looked the same, the arrangement of boulders the same. I recognized an old log bridging a small ravine, something I had definitely seen before. Could I have gotten turned around that badly? Confused, I consulted the soggy map. It was still mostly illegible. I tried to make sense of the patterns, but portions of the lines had blurred. I tried to orient myself by the ridgeline I could see. The logic in my head said I should be a few hundred yards from the shelter by now, but the path ahead continued with no sign of it. For a fleeting moment, I questioned my own memory. Had I read the route incorrectly, or was I stuck in some bizarre rearranging of the woods? My sense of time was unraveling, my phone was dead, and my watch was useless. The only measure of the day was the sun, but it seemed to shift at random intervals. Sometimes it felt like noon, other times like late afternoon. Eventually, the trail dipped into a darker hollow. The canopy was so thick overhead that it looked like twilight below. The air felt colder. Max was panting, but not from heat. It was an anxious pant, the way dogs get when cornered. I wanted to turn around, but the path behind me felt equally uncertain. I pressed on, noticing that my footsteps were leaving hardly any sound. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. I noticed a shape up ahead. A figure wearing a backpack, standing behind a thick cluster of birch trees, watching me. Relief bloomed, thinking maybe it was a fellow hiker who could confirm the correct route. Then that relief turned to cold fear when I saw the figure's face peek around the trunk, only half visible. It had my face. I don't just mean it was a similar shape or color. It was like looking into a reflection. Same features, same scruffy brown hair, same 5 o'clock shadow, same parted lips. The figure stared at me with wide, hollow eyes, then slowly turned and walked deeper into the woods, stepping silently among the ferns. I stood there, legs trembling. "Hey!" I croaked. I started after it, not sure why. Maybe I wanted an explanation or to see if it was just a trick of the light. Max let out a deep, uncertain growl. My better judgment kicked in. Chasing after a random stranger, who looked exactly like me through unmarked terrain, was a suicidal idea. So I called off the chase and hurried back onto the main path. The figure had vanished anyway. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Shortly after, I came upon a small clearing. There was an old fire ring built from stones in the center. I stopped there to catch my breath. The strangest sense of déjà vu made my skin crawl. I had the uncanny certainty that I'd camped here once, even though I'd never been this far on the trail. My head was killing me, throbbing behind my eyes. I forced down half a liter of water, though it tasted metallic. Max circled me anxiously, tail lowered. I debated setting up an early camp or trying to push on. The day, if I could call it that, still had enough light to travel, but I had no idea how far the next campsite was, and I didn't want to get caught in some loop again. Eventually, fear won out. I decided to make camp in the clearing, even though the place gave me the creeps. Perhaps if I rested, I could get my bearings in the morning. Or, if something went wrong, I could at least call for help on the satellite phone while I still had partial battery. I set the tent quickly, scanning the surrounding woods, half expecting that figure with my face to appear again. The silence pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. As night crept in, I tried to start a fire with the dry wood and tinder I could find. Despite my best efforts, the flames sputtered and died repeatedly, as if the wood were damp or the air too still. After more than 20 minutes of coaxing, I finally got a feeble flame going, but it was unstable, flickering from orange to greenish blue. I piled on more wood. Within minutes, it all blackened and crumbled, leaving me with a pit of glowing coals that gave almost no warmth. I retreated to the tent early. I fed Max from one of my freeze-dried meal pouches. He seemed disinterested at first, but eventually ate. I forced down a little of my own meal. Anxiety left me with no appetite. Despite the oppressive quiet, I thought I heard faint movement in the forest, a scraping or a shuffling, sometimes whispering, but never close enough to identify. Sometime around what I assumed was midnight, Max woke me with a sharp bark. I jerked upright, my heart in my throat. The tent was still zipped, but I sensed movement outside. I crept forward, unzipped the flap an inch, and peered out. The remains of my fire were glowing faintly. On the far side of the ring, just at the edge of the clearing, crouched a figure. The flickering embers lit half its face. My face. It smiled at me. This time, the grin was too wide, like someone who didn't quite know how to smile. Its head cocked in a jerk, and my voice emerged from its mouth. "David," it whispered in my own tone, exactly as if I were speaking from inside its throat. I snapped the flap closed and clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Max was snarling, a low rumble in his chest. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. Outside, the leaves crunched, and the night was silent again. I lay there, trembling. The adrenaline was so potent it made me sweat despite the cold. Sleep eventually claimed me like a hammer to the back of my head. By morning, if that was truly morning, the temperature had plummeted. The sky outside was dim, barely lit by a bluish light that might have been dawn or twilight. I felt nauseous and fatigued. Max was missing. His corner of the tent was empty, the flap zipped shut. Panic surged. He couldn't have unzipped the tent from inside, it was closed. So how had he gotten out? I scrambled outside, calling for him. My throat was raw from shouting. Eventually, I found him on the far side of the clearing, sitting strangely still among the ferns. He was facing away from me, just staring at the ground. I ran up, tears threatening to spill, afraid I'd find him dead. But he was breathing. He turned slowly, and I saw his eyes. They looked off, dull, as if he didn't recognize me. He didn't come when I called. Normally, Max would bounce to his feet, tail wagging. Now, he just regarded me with a flat, unreadable expression. My heart twisted. "Buddy," I whispered, stepping closer. After a moment, he rose to all fours and trudged back to the tent, ignoring me. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't respond to my presence at all. I examined him closely. He had no visible injuries, but there was dried mud on his paws that smelled faintly of the creek. His ears lay flat against his head. Something about him felt hollow. Desperate for normalcy, I packed up camp as fast as possible, ignoring my hunger pains. Max sat silently and watched me, his head unmoving. The new day felt suffocatingly still. In the pit of my stomach, I could feel a wave of dread rolling up my spine. This was no ordinary hiking trip gone wrong. Something unnatural was happening. I checked the satellite phone. It was still blinking that error screen, but after fiddling with it for a few minutes, I got a flicker of life. The battery icon showed 50%. The device beeped, searching for a signal. Then it froze. I nearly threw the thing in frustration. I tried once more, and the screen cleared for a split second, showing 12 a.m. as the time. No date, just midnight. Then it died again. I decided I was done with this insane journey. I would find the shortest route back to the main trailhead or any sign of civilization and get out. Even if it took me an entire day, or if I had to bushwhack. I had no illusions about how risky that could be, but pressing further into the unknown seemed far more dangerous. I took one last look around the clearing, scanning for that doppelganger, then headed east, at least what I believed to be east, in the hope of hitting the main loop and following it back to the parking area. Max followed, but he walked behind me, never meeting my eyes, never sniffing around like he normally would. We pressed on for what felt like hours. The forest seemed to change around me, the undergrowth thickening, the path disappearing. Soon, I was just forging ahead through the trees, certain I'd find a creek or an elevation change that I recognized. The land sloped gently downward, at odds with my memory of the topography, and had tripped multiple times over twisted roots. My ankles ached. There were times when it seemed as if the air itself was pressing in on me, compressing the space so that I'd travel a mile in what felt like a few minutes, or else I'd walk for an hour and find I was in the same place, like the ground was shifting under my feet. I started glimpsing things in the corners of my vision. Old, moldering tents half buried in the leaves, or skeletal remains of long-dead animals. But when I approached, they'd vanish. Then I found the body. I smelled it first, a rancid, iron-laced stench that made me gag. Max stopped abruptly, staring ahead. In a small hollow between mossy rocks lay what appeared to be a human corpse. The limbs were twisted unnaturally, pinned to a trunk with wooden stakes. A tattered hiking shirt and pants clung to the ravaged flesh. The face, or what was left of it, was skinned away, revealing raw muscle and bone. But in places, the muscle was changing color, growing patches of new, pale skin that looked eerily like my own tone. Some of the hair on the scalp was brown, just like mine. I almost vomited on the spot. Then I noticed the boots. They were the same brand and model as mine, same color, even the same size from what I could tell. Shaking, I crouched closer, The smell was overpowering. A hideous roiling in my stomach threatened to empty it. The flesh was too decayed to identify features but the shape of the jaw, the line of the shoulders. It was all too familiar. It was like looking at an abandoned attempt by that doppelganger to form a copy of me. The half-grown face, twisted in an empty rictus grin, burned its image into my mind. I stumbled backward, trembling, tears blurring my vision. Who was this? What was this? My immediate thought was to run. Max, however, approached the body, sniffing once, then letting out a low growl. He turned to look at me with eyes that were once again strangely blank. I tugged him away. As I did so, I noticed something pinned under the body, a battered hiking journal. The edges of the pages were soaked in congealed blood. I couldn't bring myself to retrieve it. I fled the scene, half sobbing, needing distance between myself and that horrific sight. Panic set in. I started running, ignoring the brambles that tore at my clothes and the branches that whipped my face. I just needed to get away. Max ran too, silent, keeping pace behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps. I nearly fell multiple times. At last, my foot snagged on a root, and I slammed against a tree trunk. Pain shot through my shoulder, and I collapsed to my knees. That's when I realized Max wasn't with me anymore. I scanned the area. No sign of him. I called his name, forcing my voice to rise above the pounding in my head. Nothing. Fear for him outweighed the revulsion I'd just experienced. My best friend in the world was missing, alone in these twisted woods. "Max!" I shouted until my throat hurt. I limped in circles, looking for any trace of his paw prints in the loamy ground. Nothing. Time stretched. My watch read 2:14 a.m., still taunting me with its frozen face. The forest grew darker. I waited, calling for him until I thought I'd pass out. My heart hammered. Then, after what could have been an hour or 5 minutes, impossible to tell, he emerged from behind a cluster of trees. Relief soared for an instant. Then I noticed how he walked. His movements were stiff, mechanical. He stopped a few yards away, raised his muzzle, and stared at me. His mouth opened a fraction, and I heard a soft rasping sound almost like a whisper. A chill shot down my spine. I stepped toward him, voice trembling. "Where were you, boy? Are you okay?" He didn't move. Then he blinked once, but too slow, like it was forced. A deep grin pulled across his jaws, an expression that no real dog would wear. I jerked back. His eyes were dark, reflective discs that seemed to swallow light. Something inside me screamed that this was not Max. Then, in a horrifying moment, he trotted back toward me, tail wagging in a perfect imitation of normal dog behavior. For a second, I almost believed he was my Max again. But the air around him felt wrong. When I reached for him, he snarled. I recoiled, my heart pounded in confusion and terror. I didn't have time to process any of it. He simply stared at me, breathing heavily. I tried once more to approach, and he lunged, snapping his jaws an inch from my thigh. I stumbled away. He advanced slowly, lips peeled back from his teeth in a silent snarl. That's when I realized something. Maybe Silas the Skinwalker, though I had no name for it then, had taken my dog. Or it had entered him. Possessed him, however you want to phrase it. I backed away, tears in my eyes. "Max," I pleaded, "it's okay, buddy." But the dog only tilted his head as if listening, then charged. I barely avoided his teeth, stumbling behind a tree. Max slammed into the trunk, shook himself off, and whirled around. Gone was any sign of recognition in his eyes. I managed to grab a broken branch off the ground. I hated the thought of hurting him, but he looked ready to tear me apart. He pounced again. I swung the branch, more to scare him off than anything. It connected with a sickening thud against his shoulder. He yelped and fell sideways, then rose with a trembling, furious energy. I locked eyes with him, heart battered by heartbreak and terror. He lunged once more. I struck again, this time catching him in the ribs. My hands shook as I did it. He let out a strangled yowl that hurt worse than any wound I'd received. His eyes flickered. For a split second, I saw Max in there, his ears drooping, confusion in his gaze. I almost dropped the branch. Then he growled and lunged again. We clashed in a swirl of teeth and wood. I screamed in pain as his jaws closed around my forearm, snapping down. The agony was immediate, hot, and nauseating. I flailed with the stick, striking the side of his neck, prying his jaws away. Blood poured from my arm. My vision swam. Suddenly, he released me and backpedaled a few steps, panting. The corners of his mouth twitched, and a string of saliva dangled from his fangs. Then, without warning, he bolted off into the underbrush, bounding away so fast I couldn't follow. All that remained was the throbbing of my arm, the rustle of disturbed leaves, and an overwhelming sense of loss that threatened to crush me. I bandaged my arm as best I could using the first aid kit from my pack. My mind reeled. I needed help. Medical help, any help. The wound wasn't a clean puncture, it was a deep tear near my wrist. The blood soaked through the gauze quickly, so I layered more. The pain radiated up to my shoulder. Forcing myself onward, I limped through the woods again, using the slope of the land to guess my direction. I wanted to find a main trail, a forest road, anything that might lead to a rescue, or at least an area with more hikers. At one point, I realized that I might be losing too much blood, so I paused and elevated my arm. The bandages were soaked, but the bleeding was slowing. Time passed in a haze of agony and confusion. Eventually, the terrain changed from dense woods to a more open hillside. I stepped out onto a small clearing with waist-high grass, partly dried by the erratic climate. A bizarre sense of déjà vu washed over me again. There was a battered wooden sign near a large oak tree. Its words were unreadable from rot and moss, but I thought it might be an old boundary marker for the forest. Encouraged, I pressed closer. Then I heard a crack behind me. I spun. The doppelganger stood near the edge of the clearing. It wore the same clothes I did, but dirtier, torn. Its eyes were wide, lips curved into a manic grin. My face, but so very wrong. I stepped back in terror. It mirrored me, stepping forward with the same stance, the same tilt of the head. Then it muttered in my voice, "David," like a broken record. I staggered away, half delirious from blood loss. I felt a cold wave of hatred and fear. This thing had stolen my dog, rummaged through my pack, left me lost and desperate. "Get away from me," I whispered, brandishing the broken branch. The doppelganger just cocked its head, that grin stretching further than any human mouth should. I realized it had something clutched in its hand. My watch? It was strapped around its knuckles, the face cracked. It was holding it up for me to see. The hands still read 2:14 a.m. in that mocking, frozen time. My anger flared in a surge of adrenaline. I advanced a step, the makeshift club ready. The creature's grin quivered. Then it lunged, impossibly fast. We collided. I swung the stick with all my might. It connected with the side of its head. The creature spun, letting out a breathy, inhuman hiss. Before it could recover, I swung again and caught it in the shoulder. It screeched, staggering to its knees, dropping my watch in the grass. That's when I saw the side of its face. Chunks of it were half-formed, sliding around like melted wax. It was trying to hold itself together. A wave of revulsion burned through me. I raised the branch for a final blow, heart pounding. The thing looked up, eyes full of vile hatred. It tried to speak in my voice, but the words came out as guttural choking. In that moment, I felt a primal terror, like if I didn't finish it, it would finish me. So I swung as hard as I could, feeling the branch splinter on contact with its skull. The creature collapsed in the grass, its limbs twitching. A putrid, blackish fluid seeping out. Panting, I stared at the body. It convulsed, the features dissolving into a grotesque stew of half-formed flesh and bone. My ears rang with the enormity of what I'd done. Then, in a final spasm, the creature stilled, its eyes rolling back into a ruined face that no longer resembled mine at all. I dropped the broken stick and stumbled away, chest heaving. I felt no triumph, only a creeping dread. I'd crippled it, or maybe even killed it. But if it was truly dead, why did I still feel its presence looming? I picked up my watch from where it had dropped in the grass. The glass was spiderwebbed with cracks. Still frozen at 2:14 a.m., I pocketed it without thinking. Then I forced my shaking legs to keep moving. I needed to escape this place, find a road, find a ranger station or a highway, something, anything. The next few hours were a blur of pain and confusion. I trudged through gullies and over ridges, my wounded arm throbbing. At one point, I slipped down a steep embankment and felt a jolt of blinding agony in my right leg. I screamed, half sure I'd broken it. After a few moments, I managed to hobble upright. The leg was sprained or maybe fractured. I used a sturdy branch as a crutch, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. Soon, I noticed the sky had taken on a uniform grayness, as though all color had bled out. No normal day-night cycle existed here anymore. It was a perpetual twilight that made me want to scream. My lips cracked from thirst. I paused at a small creek to drink, ignoring the metallic taste, cursing that my purifier was somewhere in my disordered backpack. My brain was fuzzy with exhaustion. I had the sense that time was meaningless, minutes bleeding into hours or days. Finally, I saw the sign for a trailhead in the distance. My heart soared. It was a battered wooden post with an arrow. I dragged myself toward it, ignoring the searing pain in my leg. When I got closer, my hope drained away. The sign read, "Standing Indian Campground," in peeling letters. An arrow pointed left, stating, "Parking area, 0.5 miles." I recognized it from the day I started. The area around it was identical to the parking spot, but my car was nowhere in sight. Had I somehow looped back? Or was this a mocking illusion? The half-mile walk to the so-called parking area took everything I had. When I emerged into a clearing that should have had my car, I saw only a wide, empty gravel lot. No vehicles, no sign of recent activity. My chest seized with panic. I hobbled across the gravel, tears streaming down my face, biting my lip until I tasted blood. I sank to my knees. This was impossible. I was so tired and so much pain I could barely think. I half expected to see that shapeless doppelganger staggering out of the woods behind me. Instead, there was only silence, the hush of wind in the pines. The sun, if it was the sun, had dimmed behind heavy clouds. I wanted to scream for help, but I had little strength left. In the distance, beyond the parking area, I spotted a small group of figures. My first thought was that it was a search party, maybe rangers. My instincts balked. What if they were illusions or more of those mimics? But the rational part of me knew I couldn't survive alone much longer. I forced myself to stand, gritting my teeth, leaning on my branch as a crutch. I waved weakly and called out, "Please, help!" My voice sounded like gravel. The figures turned. They seemed to hesitate, then approached cautiously. As they drew closer, I saw they were hikers, each carrying a backpack. A woman in a baseball cap led the way, flanked by 2 men and another woman. Relief surged, but I also felt a stab of fear that they would see me as some delirious lunatic. Maybe I was. Still, I stumbled forward. The lead hiker lowered her trekking pole in a defensive posture, eyes wide. I realized how I must appear. Battered, blood-stained, clothes torn, filth all over me, a wild look in my eyes. "Please," I croaked. "I'm David Reeves. I need help. I was attacked. My dog." My words came out disjointed, and I wasn't sure they made sense. One of the men stepped forward, his face pale. "Did you say David Reeves?" he asked. "Yes, David Reeves," I repeated, tears slipping down my cheeks. He exchanged a look with the woman in the baseball cap. She dug into her pocket and pulled out a phone. "Look," she whispered to him, and they both looked at the screen, unsettled. Their expressions darkened. I couldn't see what they were showing each other, but it filled them with alarm. They whispered among themselves. The second woman glanced at me, eyes filled with a mix of pity and horror. My hand shook as I pressed it against my wounded arm, fresh blood soaking through the makeshift bandage. "What's going on?" I rasped. "Please, help me." The man who had spoken first turned his phone toward me. On the screen was a news article with a bold headline: "Local hiker presumed dead. David Reeves. Body found mauled near standing Indian shelter." Accompanying it was a photograph. My photograph. Or at least a man who looked just like me, down to my angled jawline, scruffy hair, the same color eyes, the same faint scar on my chin from childhood. He was smiling in the picture. A gentle half-smile like something from a driver's license photo, but the grin was a bit too wide, almost forced. My entire body went cold. "That's not me," I whispered. "That can't be real. I'm right here." My vision swam. The hikers huddled closer together, uncertain. The man said, "This article's from last week. They found your body, or someone's body, near the shelter. Mauled by something." He looked over the phone at me. "So, who are you?" Everything in me threatened to unravel. The swirl of confusion, the pain, the sense of unreality. "I am David Reeves," I insisted, my voice quivering. I tried to take another step, but my leg collapsed under me. I fell to my knees. The phone screen glared in my eyes. The photo of me in that headline stared back, the grin seeming to grow. I could see the fear in their eyes, a tension that suggested they might run at any second. My entire torso trembled from shock and exhaustion. Tears dripped from my chin, mixing with the dirt on the gravel. I wanted them to help, to call an ambulance or something. But who was I to them? A ghost? A doppelganger? Some twisted creature from these woods? The woman took a cautious step forward, rummaging in her backpack. "He's bleeding," she said softly. "We can't just leave him." A tall man with a beard scowled, gripping her arm. "We should look at him. He's crazy, or worse." I gazed up at them, despair flooding my heart. "Please," I whispered again. "I'm just me." But the bearded man shook his head. He drew back, eyes hard. "I'm sorry," he muttered, and started to back away. The other hikers followed suit, torn between compassion and terror. A few more steps, and they were gone from my immediate view, though I could still hear their muffled voices. One last time I tried to rise, but white-hot pain lashed through my leg. I let out a sob and fell, the gravel biting into my knees. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, but eventually I sensed the presence of someone standing over me. I fought to open my eyes, half delirious, expecting the hikers to have returned. Instead, I saw a single figure. My stomach clenched in fear. It was me again, a figure with my face, my voice, but different from the doppelganger I'd crippled. It looked more complete. The edges of its features didn't melt or flicker. Its eyes glistened with something close to human intelligence. It crouched beside me and whispered in my own voice, "David." I tried to scream, but only a ragged whisper escaped my mouth. I was too weak to resist. The figure placed a cold hand on my temple, leaning close. I could smell damp earth on its breath. Then it parted its lips in a kind of mocking sympathy and said, "Time to go," in a tone that was half command, half invitation. The last thing I remember is the swirl of gray sky, the hush of the forest, and the taste of blood in my mouth. My vision dimmed. My heart thundered once, twice. Then everything was a black void. I woke up in a hospital bed, or at least it looked like one. A sterile white ceiling overhead, the beep of monitors. My leg was bandaged heavily, my arm bound in thick gauze. The place smelled of disinfectant. My head pounded. I tried to sit up, but an alarm beeped and a nurse rushed in. She was an older woman with kind eyes. She gently pushed me back down, telling me to relax, that I'd been found unconscious in the national forest by a search and rescue team. My mouth was too dry to respond properly, so she brought water. "You're lucky to be alive," she told me, checking my vitals. The next day, I was questioned repeatedly by local authorities, rangers, even a detective. They asked me about the hikers who found me, about the injuries on my arm and leg, about my dog. I told them as much as I could remember, but I must have sounded insane. I spoke of shapeshifters, lost time, a dead version of myself. They gave me polite, concerned looks and told me I'd been delirious from an infection and exposure. A doctor explained that my injuries had gotten infected, leading to a severe fever and vivid hallucinations. According to them, I'd been reported missing after failing to return from my hike. They found me miles from where I was supposed to be, in a ravine, barely alive. They asked if I had any next of kin or loved ones to contact. I gave them a list of co-workers and acquaintances. Later, I asked them about the news article the hikers had shown me. The phone, the photo. Nobody knew what I was talking about. No such article existed, at least not in any local or national paper. No remains had been found near the standing Indian shelter. No body identified as David Reeves. They insisted it was all a fever dream. My phone, they said, was discovered near me, cracked, but not so damaged as to be unreadable. When they charged it, the battery was fine. They found no photos or references to my supposed demise. When I was stable enough to walk, I hobbled my way to a small window overlooking the forest beyond the hospital's parking lot. It looked so ordinary. Blue skies, rolling mountains, just a normal day in North Carolina. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. Something watched me from the tree line. The nightmares hadn't stopped, even when my fever broke. I dreamed of that doppelganger standing at the foot of my hospital bed. I dreamed of Max with dead eyes, wagging his tail slowly as he advanced. And worst of all, I dreamed of the hiking group, staring at me with pity and horror while holding up a phone that told me I was dead. Weeks have passed since then. My arm still aches with phantom pain. My leg is in a brace, but healing. The doctors say the infection almost cost me the limb. They are still uncertain how I survived alone for so long in those remote woods. In quiet moments, I can't help replaying everything in my mind. Was it real? Was it all some twisted hallucination? Yet, in the silent hours of the night, I hear the click of claws on tile outside my hospital room. A low panting that might be my imagination. In the reflection of the window, I sometimes see my own face looking back. And behind me, there's the faint outline of another version of me, smiling too wide. I try not to blink, afraid that the reflection might move on its own. The hair on my arms stands up. I remember the battered watch. The final time it showed was 2:14 a.m. Sometimes, even now, I wake up feeling certain it's that exact moment, no matter what the clock says, as though I'm stuck in that endless loop of uncanny night. I'll never be sure if I escaped standing Indian Mountain, or if something else came back in my place. Even now, on my good days, When I look outside at the normal bustle of the hospital parking lot, I catch myself wondering if any of this is truly over. The dread gnaws at my heart, because I can't forget the last words I heard from that shape crouched above me, wearing my face. Time to go. I can still hear it echo in my mind as if it's calling me back. My name is John Mercer. I'm 37 years old, and everything I'm about to share happened in October of 2022, deep in the Uvari National Forest in North Carolina. It's taken me months of therapy and introspection to get the events in order. Sometimes, I still don't believe it actually happened, that any of it could be real, but the nightmares keep coming, and the doctors don't have a good explanation. So, I'm going to lay it out here, in my own words, just as I remember it. I'm not a veteran or anything like that. I used to work in corporate IT, a desk jockey in Raleigh. It was a decent living. It kept a roof over my ex-wife and me. When the divorce papers came, the office gossip spread like wildfire. I felt betrayed by the life I'd built, and I withdrew from everything. My job, my friends, all of it. A few months later, they started laying off people in my department, and I was one of the first to go. The severance package was meager, and I realized that, aside from the apartment I could barely afford, I had nowhere to go. No support, no future in the city. I'd always liked the outdoors, ever since I was a kid going on small hikes in local forests. But I'd never done anything close to living off-grid. However, I had enough in savings to buy a patch of land at the edge of the Uvari National Forest, a neglected corner that nobody seemed to want. The idea was simple. Get away from everything and everyone, learn to live off the land, and figure out what I wanted from life without any distractions. It took me months to build a small cabin. I taught myself the basics through old survival books, YouTube videos, back when I still had consistent internet, and some trial and error that left me with more than one blackened thumb. The place was rough, not much bigger than a studio apartment, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and a wood stove. I even managed to rig a small solar panel to charge my phone and power a single electric bulb. It was enough. I wasn't completely alone either. I had Huck, my dog, a blue heeler mix that I'd rescued from a shelter a year prior. He was loyal, smart, and a better companion than most humans I'd known. He liked the forest life even more than I did. I often joked he was the real mountain man, and I was the pampered city dog. For a time, it was peaceful. The forest was alive with birds and small critters. The wind in the trees lulled me to sleep every night, and I was proud of what I'd accomplished. But as summer bled into fall, things started to go wrong. First, there were small mishaps. A trap I'd set for rabbits went missing. I thought maybe a coyote or raccoon had dragged it off, or even a curious hiker. Then, my solar panel began malfunctioning. The battery wouldn't hold a charge for more than an hour. I couldn't figure out why. It all looked fine. My phone started dying randomly even when it showed a full charge. The forest, once warm and inviting, began to feel strange. The wind sounded different, almost like whispering. By early October, I began to notice time slipping away from me. Not just losing track of the hours, like you might when you're in a quiet place, but actual disorientation. I'd wake up believing it was Wednesday, only to realize my phone's date said Friday. Or I'd go out to gather wood for half an hour, then check my watch to see it was somehow 3 hours later. I chalked it up to stress or the abrupt change of lifestyle. I tried to keep a written journal of my days, forcing myself to note every morning what I planned to do, then writing down each night what I actually did. The entries didn't match up. Sometimes I'd find 2-3 days of blank pages with no memory of skipping them. It was around this time that Huck started acting out of character. He was normally well-behaved, rarely barked at nothing, but now he would stand at the door of the cabin, hackles raised, growling low in his throat as if he sensed a trespasser. I'd go outside, rifle in hand, looking for a bear or a coyote. Never saw anything. Sometimes at night he'd jump up from a dead sleep and snarl at the dark corners of the cabin. At one point, he even refused to eat from the bowl I set out, nosing at it like it smelled bad. I tasted the water. It was fine. I tasted the kibble, which was ill-advised, but it tasted normal to me, or at least like dry, bland dog food. Huck just wouldn't touch it. That was how things were for a couple of weeks. Small, unsettling anomalies stacking up, but nothing that screamed supernatural or dangerous. Until one evening, near dusk, I found a man by the creek. I'd gone down to refill my water containers before dark. The creek is about half a mile from my cabin, near an area the locals call Devil's Bend. It's a narrow, twisting stretch where the creek makes a sharp S-curve around a cluster of jagged rocks. Why call it the Devil's Bend, I don't know. Probably just a bit of local lore to make it sound ominous. But that day, I found a naked man kneeling at the water's edge, shivering, arms wrapped around his chest. He looked half frozen, though it was only mid-October. My first thought was that maybe a hiker had fallen into the creek and lost his gear. Or maybe he was a homeless man who'd wandered way off the beaten path. Concerned, I knelt beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. His skin was ice cold, and he barely responded to me. "Hey," I said quietly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you hurt? Are you alone?" He lifted his head, and I saw dark eyes, like the color of black coffee. Something in them felt off, but I couldn't place it. That moment, though, I was more worried about his safety. His lips were cracked and bluish, and his hair was caked with mud and debris. "Please," he whispered, "help me!" I made him stand. He was surprisingly light, with almost no resistance. He wobbled on his legs, so I ended up hoisting him over one shoulder, carrying him back to my cabin. Huck followed at a careful distance, hackles raised. The dog didn't bark or lunge at the stranger, but he kept snorting as though the man reeked of something foul. Inside, I gave the guy an extra pair of sweatpants and an old flannel shirt. He offered no name at first, just stared at me like I was the greatest miracle in the world. I heated water over my stove, made him sip from a mug. Eventually, he spoke in a low, soft voice. "My name's Eli." I introduced myself, told him I was John Mercer. He repeated my name slowly, as if trying it on his tongue. John Mercer. It sounded odd in his mouth, like an echo of my own voice. I shrugged it off as simple shock or dehydration. He seemed exhausted, so I let him rest on my bunk while I moved to my small table and tried to figure out where I'd put my phone. My first instinct was to call for help, to get the authorities out here, but the phone battery was dead again. That strange glitch. I cursed under my breath. The nearest ranger station was a 2-hour hike, and darkness would be on me in less than an hour. I tried to get some sense out of him. "Where are you from? Are you lost? Did you have a backpack?" He barely answered. He just stared past me, eyes half-lidded, murmuring occasional words. Cold, lost, darkness, that kind of thing. I didn't want to push him. I figured I could wait until morning, then escort him to the ranger station, or maybe drive him to the nearest hospital if I managed to get my truck started. My truck had been finicky in recent days as well. Some electrical short I hadn't gotten around to fixing. That night, the weirdness blossomed into full-blown terror. After giving Eli some soup, I laid down on the floor, letting him have the bed. Huck kept circling the bunk, sniffing at the air, then walking to the door, whining to be let out. Finally, I got up and let the dog outside. He darted off into the darkness. I expected him to return quickly. Huck never wandered off far. Instead, he didn't come back that night. I was too worried to sleep. My mind was racing with 1,000 questions. Should I go after Huck right away? But it was pitch black. I had no idea which direction he'd gone. Should I keep watch over Eli? What if he needed medical attention? I told myself I'd wait an hour or two, see if Huck returned, and check on Eli in the meantime. As I dozed fitfully, the fire in the stove changed color. One moment it was the usual orange glow, then it flickered blue like a gas flame. The shadows on the cabin walls danced in bizarre shapes that made me nauseous. I glanced at my watch and was startled to see it was already 4 a.m. That was impossible. It had only been around 10 p.m. a moment ago, but the watch insisted it was 4 a.m. The strangest part, I felt as though I'd only dozed for a minute or two. In the corner, I heard a rustling sound. Eli was sitting up in the bunk, arms at his sides, staring into the dying embers of the stove. His face was half illuminated by that weird blue flame, revealing hollows under his eyes and a slight grin pulling at the corners of his mouth. I was about to ask if he was okay, but he spoke first, so quietly I barely caught it. "John Mercer," he said, "you're a gracious host." I swallowed. My throat felt dry. "No problem," I managed. "You need anything? Water?" He didn't answer. He just stared. Eventually, I lay back down, trying to ignore the crawling sensation on my skin. Something about him set me on edge. It was more than just the strangeness of finding a naked guy by a creek. It was as though he exuded a kind of presence. That's the only word for it. Somehow, I drifted off again, and when I woke, sunlight was trickling through the small window. I startled upright. Eli was still in my bunk, lying on his back, eyes closed. My watch read 7 a.m., only 3 hours after I'd last seen it read 4 a.m. I shook my head in confusion. Did I dream the whole time slip? Huck was still missing, so I grabbed my boots and went outside to call for him. No response. Feeling worried, I decided to make breakfast and then check on Eli before heading out to search for Huck more thoroughly. But as I was preparing some oatmeal, I found that half my food had spoiled overnight. Bags of flour and rice that had been fine the day before were now riddled with mold. I gagged at the smell. Even the oatmeal in my pot looked congealed and black around the edges, like it was rotting from the inside out. I tossed everything out, cursing at my loss of supplies. That was at least a week's worth of rations, gone. I made do with some canned fruit I had left. I offered some to Eli. He accepted, ate quietly, then asked if I had fresh clothes he could borrow. I gave him an old shirt, a pair of jeans that didn't really fit but were better than nothing. He nodded, rummaging through my cabin as though it were his place, pausing to examine my makeshift bookshelf. "I appreciate your kindness," he said at one point, without looking at me. I half expected him to say more, to give me some sort of explanation of who he was or how he'd ended up in the creek. But he didn't, and something about his demeanor shut me down. It was as if the words were stuck in my throat, like some intangible force warned me not to pry. When I stepped outside again to call Huck, I noticed the sky was a dull gray color, though there weren't any clouds. The light seemed muted, like twilight, but it was clearly morning. The forest seemed quieter than usual. No bird calls, no scampering squirrels, just a faint wind rustling the leaves. I spent the next few hours scouring the surrounding woods for Huck. I found no traces, no tracks, no scat. It was as if he'd vanished. My chest felt tight. Huck wasn't the type of dog to run away. For months in the forest, he'd always come back, trotting into the cabin for a treat or a belly rub. Now, silence. Returning to the cabin, I braced myself for more unpleasantness, but Eli was nowhere to be seen. The bunk was empty, the door was wide open, and my table was cleared except for a single note in my handwriting. Don't trust the man. I blinked. I had no memory of writing those words. Fear jolted me like an electric current. Why would I write that? When had I written it? Had I been sleepwalking? There was a crudely drawn symbol under the text, a crude figure of a tall shape with horns. My mind turned over 1,000 possibilities. I tried to remember if maybe I'd scribbled it in a half-dreaming state. I went outside, calling Eli's name. A few hundred yards from the cabin, I saw him standing at the edge of the tree line, looking up at the sky. When I approached, he glanced over his shoulder at me, a serene expression on his face. "It's a beautiful morning," he said. "Feels like time is slowing down." I stared at him, searching for any sign of a hidden motive. He met my gaze with such calm that it unnerved me. Without waiting for me to speak, he started walking back toward the cabin. I followed, full of questions, but speechless. Something about the note in my handwriting telling me not to trust him overshadowed everything else. The day passed in a haze of small, unsettling experiences. The fire refusing to light properly, despite plenty of dry kindling, the sky growing darker by midday but still not clouded, the intermittent flickering of the single light bulb I had in the cabin, and always, the suffocating sense that time was folding in on itself. I'd check my watch, see that an hour had passed, then realize I'd lost 3 or 4. Each time my heart pounded. I tried writing the time down, but the next time I looked, my scribbled entry was either gone or unreadable. By late afternoon, I resolved to make the hike to the ranger station. Something was too wrong here. I needed help, or at least confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. I told Eli my plan and said he could come with me if he wanted. He cocked his head as though considering, then simply said, "I'll stay." For some reason, the finality in his tone made me hesitate, but I forced myself to gather my gear, a small backpack, a canteen, some leftover jerky, a flashlight, and my phone, even though it had been randomly dying. Halfway down the trail toward the station, my phone went off. The screen brightened, showing 11:59 p.m. Then it died again. It was broad daylight. I pushed on, ignoring it, determined to make it to the main trail. But an hour later, the sky was pitch black, and I was back at Devil's Bend. I don't even remember turning around or changing my route. One moment I was on the path to the ranger station, the next I was crouched by the creek in total darkness. I cursed, shining my flashlight around, but the beam flickered and cut out. The moon was absent, as though it had fled the sky. I stumbled around the sharp bend of the creek, hands trembling. That's when I found my first real horror. The beam of my flickering flashlight lit something swaying from a low branch. I approached, dread welling up in my gut. The shape became clearer. Huck's body. My dog was hanging from a noose braided with rags of my own shirts. His paws were gone, stumps tied in bloody bandages. His eyes were open, dull, reflecting no light. I let out a ragged scream, dropping the flashlight. My mind couldn't process it. Huck had been my companion, my friend, my lifeline out here. Now he was dead, worse than dead, mutilated and put on display. I collapsed to my knees, sobbing, lost in a tornado of grief and horror. Every bit of me wanted to tear that thing down, cradle Huck, and beg for forgiveness that I hadn't protected him. But fear anchored me, and I just sat there, tears coursing down my cheeks. How long I stayed, I don't know. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, a voice spoke behind me, soft, gentle. "I'm sorry you had to see that." I spun to see Eli standing in the shadows. My flashlight was at his feet. He picked it up, and the light shone onto his face, revealing that same calm expression. But in the flicker of that beam, I could swear his eyes were not just black. They had no whites at all, like twin pools of ink. "What did you do?" I growled, voice shaking with fury and fear. Eli tilted his head, as if confused by the question. "I didn't do this, John Mercer. You invited me in, don't you remember?" My heart hammered. I had no idea what he was talking about. Something about inviting him in. This had to be his handiwork, though. Who else could it be? I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled. He extended a hand to help me up, but I smacked it away, stumbling back. "What are you?" I whispered. He gave me a sad smile. "A friend," he said, "and I'm afraid the forest has other plans for you." I wanted to strangle him, to beat him to the ground until he admitted what he'd done to Huck. But a deep, primal terror held me back. Something about the blackness of his eyes and that impossibly serene demeanor told me that violence wouldn't solve anything. The air felt electric, crackling with invisible energy. I glanced at Huck's body, forced myself to look away, then turned back to find that Eli was gone. Overwhelmed, I half walked, half crawled back to the cabin. I might have taken an hour or maybe the entire night. I genuinely can't say. The forest was so dark, my flashlight so fickle. Occasionally it would flash on and I'd see shapes among the trees. Human silhouettes? Maybe. But whenever I tried to shine the light directly at them, it died. By the time I reached the cabin, I was shaking violently from cold or fear or both. I stumbled inside, slammed the door shut, and threw the deadbolt. That's when I saw something carved into the cabin wall. Something that hadn't been there before. It was a crude image of a man sleeping, while a horned figure perched above him, peering down. Underneath it were symbols I didn't recognize, swirling patterns that seemed to move if I looked at them too long. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but this was my only shelter. I checked the bunk, praying to any god that existed that maybe Huck would be there alive, that what I'd seen was just another nightmare. Of course, it was empty. A folded note lay on the pillow in my handwriting. "You're not safe. You asked for this." I felt something give way in my mind, a final tether of sanity snapping. Without thinking, I grabbed my rifle from the corner, broke open my nearly empty box of shells and stuffed them into my pocket. I didn't know what I'd shoot or how it could help, but I needed the reassurance. I needed to feel less helpless. For a while, I paced the cabin, pressing my ear to the walls, listening. The forest beyond was silent except for a faint scraping sound, like branches on the roof. Occasionally, I heard footsteps. At least, it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Then a soft knock at the door. I froze. "John," Eli's voice whispered, "you can let me in." I didn't move. The knock came again, gentle. Through the walls I heard him sigh, then silence. When morning came, assuming it was truly morning, I found my watch had stopped at 3:14 a.m. My phone was dead as well. Yet pale light filtered in through the window. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, expecting to see the mutilated body of Huck. Instead, I found fresh footprints circling the cabin. Single sets, barefoot, possibly from a man. Next to the cabin door was a small dead squirrel with its eyes carved out. I nearly vomited, then forced myself to bury the squirrel, muttering a curse under my breath. My mind felt split. Part of me screamed to run, but run where? The forest was a labyrinth now. Time made no sense. My only chance was to gather what supplies I could and attempt the ranger station again. Or maybe, if I could manage, get my truck started and drive the hell out of here. Back inside, I found that the rest of my supplies had rotted overnight. My jerky was covered in maggots. My sealed cans were rusted through and stank of decomposition. Even the water in my jugs had turned cloudy. It was impossible. Canned goods don't just rot in a day. The very laws of nature seemed to be unraveling. In a frantic state, I grabbed what was still barely edible and stuffed it in my backpack. A bottle of water that smelled mostly normal. A few energy bars that were sealed in plastic. That was all I had left. I made a break for it, heading for the main road. I reasoned that if I could follow the old logging trails, I'd eventually hit a side road that led to Highway 109. Once there, maybe I could flag down a car or find help. My pace was hurried, rifle clutched in my sweaty hands. But time kept bending. I'd glance at the sun, gauge it to be mid-morning, then after walking for what felt like 5 minutes, the sun would be high overhead. Noon, maybe. Then the next time I looked, it was hanging low in the sky again, like late afternoon. On I walked, trying not to panic, telling myself to keep a steady direction and not turn around, no matter what illusions I saw. Without warning, I found myself back at Devil's Bend. My legs were leaden, and my mouth was parched. The creek water was likely still potable, so I knelt and filled my canteen. A reflection in the water caught my eye. Standing behind me was Eli, his eyes locked onto mine. I spun, bringing the rifle up. He didn't move, just blinked slowly. "I know you're afraid," he said, "but there's no need to be. After all, you did invite me in." "Stop saying that," I hissed, aiming at his chest. My finger twitched on the trigger. "I never invited you anywhere." He offered a faint smile. "Not in words. You invited me in with your despair, your grief, your hopelessness. Isn't that why you're here in the forest, John Mercer? Because you gave up on your world. You asked for a new one." I couldn't wrap my mind around his words. It was so surreal hearing this calm, almost gentle tone while my soul was on fire with terror and rage. Huck was dead. My supplies were gone. My sense of reality was shattered. And this man, this thing, spoke about me inviting him in. I told myself to shoot, but I hesitated. Something in me knew that pulling the trigger might not achieve anything. What if bullets did nothing to him? Still, I was beyond reason. My mind cracked. I squeezed the trigger once. The rifle roared. Birds scattered from the trees. Eli staggered back, a dark stain spreading across his shirt, but it wasn't red, it was blackish, almost oily. He stared at the wound with mild curiosity, then lifted his gaze to me. As he exhaled, dark smoke billowed from the hole, drifting upward in lazy spirals. I watched, mouth agape, as the smoke coalesced into something vaguely humanoid above us before dissolving into the air. Eli gave a gentle cough, the black fluid seeping from the corner of his mouth, then collapsed onto the ground. For a long moment he didn't move. In the aftermath, the forest was silent, but for the pounding of my heart. I stepped forward, rifle still raised. I nudged his body with the barrel, half expecting him to leap up and tear me apart, but he remained still. I leaned in closer. His eyes were closed, his face slack. The wound in his chest was rimmed with that black, tar-like substance. Did I kill him? Could you even kill something like him? I couldn't leave him there. Ridiculous as it sounds, I felt a surge of responsibility. I reminded myself that, monstrous or not, he appeared as a human being. What if some part of him was human? My thoughts raced. But as I bent to examine him more closely, his eyes snapped open, revealing the pure, black orbs. He grabbed my wrist with inhuman strength. My bones felt like they might snap. The blackness in his eyes seemed to writhe like living shadows. He opened his mouth, but instead of words, I heard a chorus of voices, layered over each other, screeching. I dropped the rifle, clutching my head in agony. In that instant, the sun blinked out. Everything went pitch black. I don't just mean it got dark, I mean absolute void, no star or moonlight. I felt Eli's grip vanish, and I collapsed onto the ground, blindly groping around, searching for my rifle. My fingers found pine needles, damp soil, small stones, but no rifle. Then, faintly, I saw a dull glow in the distance, like a lantern flickering. I stumbled toward it, praying it was a sign of rescue or a normal person. As I got closer, the glow turned into the outline of a building. My cabin. It shouldn't have been there. By all rights, it was miles away. But there it was, illuminated by that faint light. I lurched forward, stepping through the door. The inside was cold, far colder than it should have been. My breath came out in white puffs. The single bulb on the ceiling flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. And in the corner, a figure huddled over something. I heard a wet, slurping noise, my chest clenched. "Hello," I whispered, though every cell in my body screamed to run. The figure stood. It was me. My own face stared back at me, eyes ringed in black, a wide grin splitting my cheeks. The doppelganger's shirt was soaked in blackish fluid, and it held a ragged piece of flesh, animal or human, I couldn't tell. The smell of iron and decay nearly made me faint. Slowly, it raised the chunk of flesh to its mouth, took a bite, and chewed with savage glee. My knees buckled. The doppelganger spoke in my voice, but it was too loud, echoing. "You asked for a new life," it said. "You wanted to leave everything behind, so you did." I tried to form words, but I was drowning in horror. The figure dropped the flesh, took a step closer. I glimpsed a shape at its feet, the head of Huck. My dog's eyes were rolled back, tongue lolling. A strangled cry tore from my throat, and I grabbed the first thing I could, an old rifle stock near the door. I swung it at the monstrosity. It connected with a sickening crack, and the doppelganger's head jerked to the side, black fluid spattering the wall. A searing pain erupted in my own head, as if I'd just been struck. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to keep hitting, again and again, until the thing collapsed. Its face flickered, shifting between my own and something horned, something far older and more malevolent. I heard the echo of 1,000 screams in my mind. My arm kept swinging on autopilot, fueled by primal terror and fury. At last, the creature lay still, half submerged in the black fluid, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I slumped to my knees, panting, tears mixing with sweat. My vision swam. The cabin walls seemed to melt like wax. Light and shadow danced. Then a shape stepped through the door. Eli, looking uninjured, smiling gently. "John," he said, voice echoing oddly. "There's still time to leave. All you have to do is let go." I brandished the broken rifle stock. "Stay back!" My throat burned. He shook his head slowly, pity in his gaze. "Don't you see?" he murmured. "You can leave this place, but you can't leave yourself. You brought me here, John. You're the one who gave me your name." As he spoke, black smoke seeped from his mouth, drifting across the cabin and winding around my legs. The stench of sulfur filled my nostrils. My limbs felt heavy, my lungs tight. I coughed, tried to back away, but the smoke ensnared me like oily serpents. My mind whirled. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. Summoning every bit of my adrenaline and will, I gripped the rifle stock, lunged at Eli. He made no move to dodge. When the weapon connected with his torso, it passed through him as though he were made of fog. But I felt something crack in my chest, a blinding pain. I dropped to the floor, gasping. The swirling smoke forced its way into my mouth, my nose choking me. I closed my eyes, thinking it was the end. I woke to blinding sunlight. A wave of disorientation slammed into me as I blinked, adjusting to the brightness. I was no longer in my cabin. I was on a paved road, half naked, near the outskirts of a small town. Cars sped by, honking at me. My clothes were torn, my skin smeared with dirt and dried blood. My breath came in ragged gasps. I was so weak I could barely lift my head. Someone must have called an ambulance because a siren wailed, and next thing I knew I was in a hospital bed, staring up at fluorescent lights. Doctors and nurses hovered, speaking words I couldn't decipher. They asked me questions. Who are you? Where do you live? What happened? I had no coherent answers. My mind reeled between nightmares and flickers of memory. I told them about Uvari, about my cabin, about the man named Eli and my dog, Huck. They gave me sympathetic looks, said I must have had a psychotic break, maybe triggered by stress and isolation. When the police investigated my land, they found the cabin burned to the ground. They claimed it had been burned for weeks, maybe months, reduced to cinders and ash. There was no sign of Huck, no sign of a naked man named Eli. They held me for observation for a few days. My physical injuries were mild, some cuts, bruises, dehydration, but my mental state was questionable. I insisted on going back to see the property for myself. An officer eventually agreed to drive me there after I was discharged, telling me to be prepared for the worst. My heart sank when we arrived. The land was scorched, blackened soil in patches, as if a fire had ripped through it. The cabin was unrecognizable, just some charred wood and debris. There were no footprints, no carved symbols, no sign of a body, human or canine. The officer shrugged, said, "I'm sorry, Mercer. Looks like lightning might have struck and set the place ablaze. You're lucky to be alive. Must have been some night." My phone, my watch, my supplies, all gone. The only evidence I had was my own memory, and even that felt fractured. No one believed me about the man named Eli with the eyes of black ink, about the bizarre loops in time, the note in my handwriting that I didn't remember writing. The doctors suggested it was a combination of extreme stress, possibly some hallucinogenic fungus in the water supply. They had a neat explanation for everything, all except Huck. To this day, I can't explain what I saw done to him or how he vanished without a trace. I tried to go back to normal life, though I'd burned every bridge when I left. I ended up couch surfing for a while, taking odd jobs, eventually working nights at a motel outside of Greensboro. The nightmares followed me relentless. I'd wake in a cold sweat, certain that I smelled burning wood and rotting meat, or that I'd see Eli smiling in the corner of the room. Worse was the sense that something was behind my eyes, watching from the inside. A few months later, I noticed something wrong in the mirror. At first, it was just the timing of my blinks or the angle of my reflection. It took me a moment to realize my reflection was blinking a split second later than I was. Each time I felt ice in my veins. I'd stare for minutes trying to catch it, but it always seemed to match up again. Until I looked away, then it would flicker. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but it kept happening. Sometimes, in my reflection, I'd see a brief flash of dark eyes, like black coffee, no whites. I'd shake my head, look again, and it'd be gone. Once, I even thought I glimpsed horns on my silhouette just for an instant. If I told anyone, they'd lock me up for sure. So I stayed quiet. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. I moved on the best I could, scraping together a meager life in an apartment on the edge of town. Yet the sense of wrongness never left me. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of a tall figure in the corner of my vision, or I'd wake to find my door open when I'd locked it. Each time, I felt that old, suffocating fear roil through my guts. I'd recall Eli's words. "You can leave this place, but you can't leave yourself." Sometimes, I questioned my memories. Perhaps it really was a stress-induced breakdown. Maybe Huck died in the fire or ran off, and my mind fabricated a demon to shoulder the blame. But then I'll see something in the mirror, my reflection's eyes going black for a split second, and I know that what happened out there in the forest was real, or at least real enough that I can't escape it. I've started journaling again, meticulously noting the date and time, checking my watch each hour. I keep them locked in a safe to ensure I can't tamper with them in a fugue state. So far, they match up with reality. No missing days, no bizarre loops. Yet, at night, I dream of that twisted shape I found in my cabin. The doppelganger chewing on rancid flesh, its face half mine, half horns. In the dream, it always turns to me and says, "You asked for this." I still don't know where to place blame. On myself for fleeing my life and wallowing in despair. On something ancient that roams the Uvari forest, waiting for lonely souls to devour. On the intangible darkness that might live in every human heart, waiting for an invitation. But I do know this. I'm different now. Something followed me out of that forest. It lurks behind my eyes, biding its time. I sense it when I catch my reflection unguarded. And it smiles with my face, whispering my own name, John Mercer, like a prayer or a curse. That's all there is. That's the truth, as best as I can lay it out. I don't expect anyone to believe me, and honestly, I envy those who don't. Because believing means acknowledging there's a darkness out there that doesn't care about reason or redemption. It only cares that you've broken, and that you'll let it in. So, that's my story. I still have nightmares, and maybe I always will. Maybe one day, the final tether will snap, and that thing behind my eyes will take over. I hope not. But if it does, I pray there's a scrap of humanity left in me that can fight back. Because sometimes the real horror isn't what you see in a haunted forest or a flickering light. It's the reflection that stares back at you, blinking at the wrong time, with a smile that doesn't quite belong. Oh, one. My name is Michael Harris. I'm 33 years old, and the events I'm about to describe happened in October of 2023. It began as an escape from the demands of my job and, in some strange way, from the restlessness I felt every time I glanced at my phone or sat in front of my computer. I guess you could say I was burned out from modern life, always online, always accessible. My old friend Daniel Reed suggested a backpacking trip in the mountains near Craggy Gardens in North Carolina. He said, "Get off the grid, see some stars. Maybe we'll remember what it's like to really talk, face to face." I can't pinpoint exactly when it all started to go wrong, but looking back, I see the cracks forming even before we stepped out of his truck. The morning sky was overcast, and the radio station we were listening to abruptly cut to static whenever we crested a ridge. For a moment, I assumed it was just poor reception. I hadn't been to Craggy Gardens in years and forgot how remote and rugged it was beyond certain points. Daniel was my best friend in high school, someone I used to camp with on weekends by a nearby river. We drifted apart in our 20s. Life took us different directions. I became a freelance graphic designer, working from home with digital clients. He went into real estate, got married, got divorced, made money, lost it, made it again. We reconnected only sporadically, texting on birthdays, liking each other's posts out of loyalty. This trip felt like an overdue catch-up session, but neither of us wanted to label it that way. We arrived at the Craggy Gardens Visitor Center sometime before noon. According to the dashboard clock, it was 11:15 a.m. Daniel parked the truck, and I hopped out to stretch my legs. My German Shepherd, Ranger, went wild as soon as I opened the door, jumping onto the gravel, sniffing at every new scent. Ranger was a rock in my life, loyal, protective, and somehow attuned to danger before I ever sensed it. The parking lot was emptier than I expected for a weekend. Maybe the forecast of cooler weather had scared people off. A cold wind swept across the ridge, rattling the fall leaves that still clung to the trees. Before we even started the hike, Daniel and I both noticed our phones had zero service. I wasn't surprised. He cursed under his breath, then shrugged and said it was exactly what we wanted. We decided to do a 3-day backpacking loop. The plan was to hike beyond some of the more popular trails, heading north along a ridgeline that eventually dipped into a lesser-used area of Pisgah National Forest. We'd brought enough food and gear for a few days: tents, sleeping bags, a small camp stove, water filters, the works. I was self-taught in backcountry camping, and though I pretended expertise, most of it came from reading articles and watching online videos. Daniel teased me as we prepped our packs by the truck. "We're all at the mercy of YouTube survival tutorials now," he said. "It's a wonder any of us can pitch a tent without Wi-Fi." I laughed. At least I'm not getting my real estate tips from the internet. He gave me a half smile. "You'd be surprised. My entire livelihood relies on social media marketing. If the grid goes down, I might as well be selling fish hooks and hush puppies." We set off, heading along a trail that wound past thick patches of rhododendron and mossy boulders. The forest was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves. Ranger was ecstatic, darting ahead, doubling back, sniffing everything. A mile or so in, we ran into a park ranger. He was an older man with a bristly mustache, leaning against a tree. He had a shotgun strapped to his back. We exchanged pleasantries. He warned us not to stray off the marked trails too far. "There are some old tales about these parts," he said, shrugging. "Folks hear voices at night, get turned around, or never come back." "Just local superstition?" Daniel asked. He didn't hide the skepticism in his tone. The ranger's stare was opaque. "More or less, but do me a favor, if you hear someone calling your name from the woods, especially at night, don't answer." He left us with that cryptic warning and resumed his patrol. Daniel and I rolled our eyes at each other, though we shared a quick moment of unease. Still, we hiked on, climbing steadily up the trail. By mid-afternoon, we'd set up our first campsite near a small clearing. The spot overlooked a valley and had enough space for both tents. Ranger was restless, but I chalked it up to excitement. I gathered tinder and small branches for a fire, while Daniel went to filter water from a nearby stream. When we tried to light the fire, though, the tinder wouldn't catch. I had decent matches and a lighter, and Daniel even used a little dab of fuel to help, but every time the flame licked the kindling, a gust of wind or some unseen force snuffed it out. Eventually, we got a weak fire going. It glowed a pallid orange, more like dying embers than a real flame, and it cast strangely elongated shadows on the ground. We spent the evening talking about old times, high school football games, teenage pranks. Daniel reminisced about the weekend we got lost on the river as kids. Ranger lay at my feet, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air. The night felt colder than I'd anticipated, and the wind had a chilling bite. Around 10 p.m., we each retreated to our tents. Mine was a small, one-person shelter with just enough room for me and Ranger if he decided to join. Daniel had a similar setup. We said goodnight, turned off our headlamps, and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off for a few hours, but I woke sometime after midnight when Ranger started whining. There was a rustling noise outside, maybe the wind or some animal. I tried to comfort him, but he remained tense, ears perked, body rigid against me. A few minutes later, I heard a faint voice. "Michael, come here." At first, I assumed I was dreaming, but then Ranger growled low in his throat. The voice was soft, distant, clearly calling my name. I unzipped my tent's door and peered out. The night was moonless, so dark I could barely see the outlines of the trees. Across the clearing, I saw Daniel's tent. He hadn't stirred. "Daniel," I whispered, forcing out a shaky laugh. "You messing with me?" No response. The voice sounded again, behind me this time. Michael. My heart pounded. It sounded like Daniel, but deeper, and the direction was all wrong. My mind went back to the ranger's warning. I retreated into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to calm Ranger. Eventually, I drifted back to fitful sleep. Morning light brought me some relief. Birds chirped. Ranger was curled at my feet. I crawled out and found Daniel already awake, rummaging through his pack. I asked him if he'd called my name last night, and he swore he hadn't. He'd slept through the entire night. When I went to check on our supplies, I discovered something unsettling. All the food we'd left sealed in a small container had gone rotten. It had been fine yesterday, canned goods, vacuum-sealed snacks, but now it reeked of decay. We opened one package, found it riddled with maggots. I shuddered, remembering I'd sealed everything carefully. Daniel cursed and said maybe the cold had damaged the seals, though I'd never heard of that happening so quickly and so completely. We still had spare provisions in our packs, but the sudden spoilage put me on edge. Daniel looked pale. He muttered a joke about ghosts, but I could hear the worry in his voice. I insisted we keep going deeper into the forest, figuring maybe we could reach another small trailhead on the other side of the ridge by tomorrow. We could cut the trip short if we wanted, or if things kept getting strange. Before we left the campsite, Daniel checked his phone. It had died overnight despite being on 70% battery the evening before. My phone still had some charge, but no signal. We tried using the GPS feature offline to confirm our location, but the map just displayed a single dot near the visitor center, as if we hadn't moved from the truck. Frustrated, we resorted to the old-fashioned map and compass I'd brought. As we walked, though, the terrain didn't line up exactly with the contour lines we expected. Daniel remarked that everything looked shifted by a mile or two. At first, I thought maybe I was making a mistake with the map. The forest can distort your sense of direction, but we trudged on, trying to align what we saw with the topography. By midday, we had hiked several miles without seeing another soul. Ranger kept stopping, sniffing the air, then letting out a small whine. As we descended into a lower section, we noticed the light seemed dimmer than it should be, like twilight even though my watch read 2 p.m. The sky overhead was a uniform gray, and the wind was picking up. Around 4 p.m. by my watch, we decided to set camp again because it was already feeling like late evening. We found a clearing near a rock outcropping that offered some shelter from the wind. Daniel started complaining that he felt dizzy, that the air felt heavier. I noticed it too, like the atmosphere itself was pressing in on us. We tried making a fire again. The same issue occurred. The flames refused to grow. It was as if the wood was damp, but it wasn't. Eventually, we managed a feeble campfire. This time, the flames had a strange greenish tinge around the edges, like burning copper. I felt a creeping sense of unreality. I told myself it was just the altitude, maybe pockets of gas from the ground. A rational mind looks for logical explanations, but the stories from the rangers circled through my thoughts. We cooked some freeze-dried meals, ignoring how bland everything tasted. Daniel grew quieter. He stared off into the shadows as if expecting something to leap out. Night fell early. I sat near the smoldering fire, poking at it, and tried to lighten the mood. "We can cut the trip short tomorrow," I offered. "I'm sure we can find a quicker route back." He nodded absently, rubbing his eyes. This place, I don't remember the Blue Ridge feeling so oppressive. When we finally crawled into our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. Ranger whined again, but eventually settled at my feet. I woke in total darkness, uncertain how long I'd slept. Ranger was standing over me, panting heavily. A sharp smell reached my nose, wet fur, sweat, and something else. Fear. I heard footsteps outside my tent, slow and deliberate. They circled around, crunching leaves. I pressed my ear to the tent wall. "Daniel," I hissed softly. No answer. The steps paused, then moved away. I exhaled. Maybe he'd gone off to relieve himself. Ranger stiffened, nose up. I heard a faint scraping sound, like nails on fabric. It felt close, but I couldn't tell from which direction. Minutes dragged on in silence. Then I heard Daniel shouting. I zipped the tent open, stumbled into the clearing. His tent was empty, wide open, no sign of him. But a few seconds later, I saw him stepping out from behind a cluster of rhododendron bushes, carrying a few branches for the fire. He smiled as soon as he saw me, but the expression lingered a beat too long. His eyes never blinked when I expected them to. "I was just gathering wood," he said, voice flat. I exhaled in relief. "Christ, you scared me. I thought you were lost out there." He tilted his head. "I told you I was stepping out, remember? But I didn't remember that." A wave of unease rippled through me. It was possible I'd been half asleep and missed him saying something. I glanced at Ranger, who stood near my leg, hackles raised. We soon realized the fire had gone out again, so Daniel dumped the branches next to the fire ring. I lit them, ignoring the bizarre crackling and a faint green glow around the edges. Daniel just stood there, watching me. It was unlike him to let me do all the work. "What's wrong?" I asked, breath puffing in the cold air. He smiled again, that too long smile. "Nothing, just tired." We sat in silence for a while. Ranger, uneasy, kept inching closer to me. I found myself not wanting to let Daniel out of my sight. He seemed changed. Subtly, yes, but changed. I tried small talk. "Remember that senior trip we took to Myrtle Beach? You got sunburned so badly you had to—" He raised an eyebrow. "Senior trip? You don't remember?" He hesitated, then laughed awkwardly. "Sure I do, it was fun." His response came too quickly, too dismissively. My heart pounded. That trip had been a defining moment of our teenage years. He should have had a dozen specific memories. Instead, his reaction was like someone who'd been told to pretend to remember. I wanted to confront him, but fear held me back. Instead, I quietly crawled back into my tent, motioning for Ranger to follow. Daniel lingered by the dead fire, staring at it. Eventually, I heard him return to his tent. Daylight came slowly. I crawled out of my tent, shivering in the morning air, and spotted something that made my stomach drop. Both my sleeping bag and Daniel's were laid out in the clearing. They looked like someone had unzipped them from the inside and carefully placed them on the ground. Even the pillows were tucked under them, as if for display. I rushed to Daniel's tent. He wasn't in there, nor was his sleeping bag. My head spun. Then I heard rustling in the brush, and Daniel emerged, looking around with apparent confusion. He said he'd woken up with a splitting headache, stepped out, and found the bags like that. That's when I noticed a smear of red on the side of his jacket. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. He looked down at it, frowned, and shrugged. Must have brushed against a berry bush. It didn't look like berries. It looked like blood. My scalp tingled in alarm, but I let it drop for the moment. We packed up hurriedly, refusing to eat, anxious to leave. Our plan became singular. Get the hell out of here. We tried to follow the ridge trail back, but as we walked, our map made less and less sense. The landmarks we were supposed to pass never appeared. Paths forked in directions that shouldn't exist. Time felt twisted. My watch read 11 a.m., but the sky looked like late afternoon, and we were both exhausted, as if it were night. The forest itself seemed to thicken and stretch. We backtracked once, only to find ourselves in the same clearing we'd left an hour before. Ranger grew agitated, barking at shadows. Eventually, we hit a rocky slope that overlooked a small valley. There was a dark hole in the side of the hill, maybe a cave entrance. If not for Ranger sniffing around, we might have missed it. We considered investigating it, hoping maybe it led through the mountain or offered some vantage point. But dread gnawed at me. At that moment, Daniel abruptly said he needed to take a break. He settled on a rock, ignoring the gusts of chilly wind. "We have to figure out what's going on," he mumbled. I noticed how pale he looked, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. I reached for his forehead to check for fever, but he jerked away. "Don't," he snapped. I studied him, seeing the strain in his eyes. Something inside me said Daniel wasn't Daniel anymore. Or if he was, something else resided in there too. He'd never been a superstitious person, but now he was muttering under his breath, picking at the rocks with a shaking hand. Ranger began pacing, whining again. I felt a rising panic. Part of me wanted to ditch Daniel. No, that was unthinkable. He was my best friend, or at least he used to be. Instead, I forced myself to sit beside him, tried to breathe, tried to ground myself. "Hey, we'll get out of here," I said softly. "We'll go down the slope, pick up the trail. We just have to keep moving." He let out a hollow laugh. "Moving where?" "Michael. We're in his time now. We can't leave." I shivered. "Whose time?" He gave me that unnervingly long smile again. Then he said a name. Lucian, in a voice that felt older and deeper than his own. Before I could respond, Daniel clutched his stomach and doubled over, letting out a low groan. Then he stood, reeling like a drunk, and started walking toward the cave entrance. He never said a word. He just pressed forward, stumbling on loose rocks. I called after him, grabbed at his arm, but he was unexpectedly strong, shaking me off. I was torn between letting him go and following him into what looked like an inky black maw in the rock face. Ranger, either braver or more foolish than me, darted ahead, trotting near Daniel's ankles. Summoning my courage, I followed them. Inside, the cave was cold and smelled of wet stone. Water dripped from the ceiling. The deeper we went, the more the darkness swallowed our flashlight beams. After a short tunnel, the passage widened into a cavern with a low ceiling, scattered with stalagmites and rock formations. In the center stood a figure, a man, barefoot, with pale skin and golden eyes that reflected our light like an animal's. He wore tattered jeans and nothing else. His skin looked too smooth, almost waxy. Ranger immediately began growling. Daniel stopped in front of the figure just a foot or two away. The man, Lucian, reached out a hand and touched Daniel's forehead gently, like a father checking for a fever. Daniel's eyes rolled back. He swayed, then collapsed onto his knees. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam danced across the cave walls, revealing twisted shapes that might have been rock formations, or might have been bodies. For a split second, I saw what looked like a corpse hanging from the stalactites overhead, but then it vanished when the flashlight shook. Lucian beckoned me closer without speaking. His voice reverberated in my head somehow, or maybe it was an echo in the cave. "Michael, come here." It was the same voice that called me in the night. Ranger barked, stepping forward protectively. Lucian cast him a sidelong glance and Ranger whimpered, tail between his legs. My dog never cowered like that. I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" He tilted his head. "I have many names. Some call me the devil, some call me a demon. This place, it belongs to me. Time here is mine to reshape." The weird part was how calm his words sounded, almost gentle. Daniel remained on his knees, head bowed, as if in a trance. I stepped backward, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon, even though it felt absurd. "Leave us alone. We're just trying to hike." Lucien's lips parted in a slight smile, revealing teeth that were too white, too even. "We've been here many times before, Michael. You always say the same thing. It always ends the same." I glanced at Daniel's hunched form, then back at Lucien. My mind scrambled for reason, for logic, but I could only think of the rotting food, the flickering fires, the distorted trails, the monstrous sense that we'd stepped into a nightmare. "Let him go," I managed. "Please." Lucien crouched down, lifted Daniel's chin. "He gave me permission. Didn't he tell you that?" "Permission for what?" "To enter," Lucien replied, touching Daniel's cheek. "He gave me his name. Names are powerful. If you'd like to walk out of here, simply offer me yours." A cold sweat broke across my skin. I recalled that weird old superstition. Giving your name to a fae or demon gave them power. It sounded insane, but everything about this cave was insane. I refused to speak, mouth so dry I could barely swallow. Lucien stood, his movements liquid, too smooth. "You can't imagine how many times we've done this, you and I. Again and again. You always refuse." Suddenly, a flash of memory seized me. Not my own, but something else. Images of me lying dead on the cavern floor, my skull caved in. Me impaled on a stalagmite. Me shredded into ribbons of flesh. Dozens of horrific endings. My limbs went numb as I saw these glimpses. Ranger barked wildly, lunging at Lucien. The man spun with impossible grace, grabbed Ranger by the scruff, and hurled him aside. My dog yelped, slamming into the rock wall with a sickening thud. He lay there, panting. I lost it then, charging at Lucien. I had no weapon except my fists. Maybe I expected to pass right through him, like a phantom, but he felt solid. He caught my wrist and twisted, forcing me to my knees. Pain shot up my arm. Daniel rose behind him, face slack, eyes half-lidded. He reached for me. I saw blood on his hands, fresh, glistening. He laid one hand on my shoulder. "Michael," he rasped, but his voice had that layered echo. "Let me show you, it's not so bad." That was the final straw. I jerked free, ignoring the crack in my wrist, and scrambled away. The adrenaline blocked most of the pain, and I reached Ranger, who whimpered but managed to stand, stumbling on unsteady legs. I retreated deeper into the cavern, hoping there was a second exit, or at least someplace to hide. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, and I realized with a jolt of horror that those twisted shapes I saw weren't illusions. The cave was filled with half-buried corpses, some skeletal, some fresh, all wearing clothing that spanned decades, maybe centuries. The stench hit me then, a cloying odor of rot masked by the cold. Lucien followed, unhurried. Daniel came too, his head lolling to the side, arms slack at his sides. It was as if he floated just above the ground, guided by unseen wires. His eyes locked onto mine, and behind them I saw nothing but emptiness. I stumbled over a loose rock, fell hard, and felt something snap in my leg. A lightning bolt of agony ripped through me, and I screamed, dropping the flashlight. Darkness swallowed everything but the faint glow from Lucien's eyes. Crawling backward, sobbing from the pain, I found a length of rusted rebar protruding from the floor, some relic, or maybe a broken spike from old mining equipment. With trembling hands I gripped it. My vision blurred with tears, and I turned it toward Lucien in a pathetic attempt at self-defense. He seemed amused, stepping forward. "Haven't we done this enough?" With a primal scream, I swung. The rebar sliced across his neck, releasing a spurt of black fluid that hissed and smoked on contact with the air. Lucien's head snapped back, and for the first time, I heard him let out a low moan, like I'd truly hurt him. Daniel clutched at his own neck, mirroring Lucien's wound. His eyes bulged, and he collapsed, thrashing on the ground. Lucien staggered, still smiling through the smoking black blood, and raised a hand as if to strike me. But I saw an opening. I lurched sideways, ignoring the white-hot agony in my leg, and scrambled away. Ranger hobbled behind me, whining with every step. Lucien's voice echoed through the cave. "You can run, Michael, but you're still in my time." I found the tunnel leading back to the entrance, half crawling, half limping. My vision narrowed, spots dancing. Behind me, I heard Daniel's gurgling screams. I hated myself for leaving him behind, but I knew I was next if I stayed. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the walls warping. I looked at my watch, 2 p.m., but the passage remained dark as midnight. Ranger's whimper spurred me forward. Finally, I saw a dim glow and emerged into the forest. Daylight, or some version of it, greeted me. It was overcast, the sky a sickly gray. I collapsed outside the cave, cradling my leg, tears streaming down my face. Ranger lay next to me, quivering. I could still hear faint echoes of Daniel's screams from inside, but I forced myself to move away, to put distance between myself and whatever was happening in there. Time lost all meaning as I staggered down slope. Every step jarred my broken leg. I used the rebar as a makeshift crutch, leaving a trail of my own blood on the rocks. Ranger did his best to stay upright, limping on what appeared to be a bruised or dislocated shoulder. I kept expecting Lucien to appear behind a tree or step out of the shadows, but the forest remained eerily still. Eventually, darkness fell again, though my watch claimed it was only 4 p.m. I collapsed under a large pine, rummaging in my pack for a headlamp, bandages, anything. Our gear was disheveled from the frantic cave escape, but I managed to splint my leg using some tent poles and a shirt. Each movement brought fresh waves of agony, forcing me to bite down to stifle my screams. Ranger curled beside me, breathing shallowly. I stroked his fur, telling him we'd make it. I fed him the last scraps of jerky I could find that weren't spoiled. In the faint glow of the headlamp, I saw that my pack's contents had begun to rot, just like the supplies before. Mold creeping along the edges of sealed packages. I drifted in and out of consciousness. I dreamed of Daniel's face, twisted in that too long smile, staring at me across an endless black void. Sometimes I saw Lucien's golden eyes. Sometimes I saw the bodies in the cave, stuck in a never-ending cycle of death. I'm not sure how many hours or days passed. At one point I heard voices and saw beams of light. I called out weakly, then blacked out again. I awoke to find myself being carried by 2 men who looked like park rangers. They loaded me into a rescue stretcher, and I saw that dawn was breaking. They gave me water, told me to stay calm. "Is there anyone else with you?" one ranger asked. "Daniel. Still inside the cave," I managed. The rangers exchanged worried glances. "We'll send a team. Just hang on." I heard them calling for a helicopter evac. Everything blurred. The next time I woke, I was in a hospital room. My right leg was heavily bandaged, and I was hooked to an IV drip. A nurse told me they'd found me alone, that my dog Ranger was also injured but alive, being cared for by a local vet. They asked me about Daniel Reed, said they found no sign of him. Search teams combed the area for days, but the storm that rolled in didn't help. Ultimately, they couldn't find a cave matching my description, though they did find a shallow overhang. They chalked my memory up to shock, trauma, and possible delirium from the cold and a head injury. In the official report, Daniel Reed was listed as missing, presumed dead. My broken leg required surgery and pins to stabilize. My wrist was sprained. They told me to expect months of physical therapy. I stayed in the hospital for a week. My mind kept replaying everything. A part of me wondered if it was truly real, or if the events had twisted in my mind due to delirium. But I knew. I had the nightmares to prove it. Eventually, I was discharged. I returned to my apartment in Asheville, still limping, reliant on crutches. Over the next few months, I tried to settle back into a normal routine, sitting at my desk, working on design projects, attending physical therapy. Ranger came home a week after me, a thick bandage around his shoulder. He was jumpy at every sound, every shadow. Friends and family tried to be supportive, but I sensed their doubt. They all believed Daniel must have slipped off a ledge and fallen, that I hallucinated the rest. The rescue team insisted they'd never known a ranger with the shotgun in that area, nor had they encountered any Lucien. But I know what I saw, and the nightmares never stopped. I often woke at 3 a.m. hearing Daniel's voice outside my window calling my name, or worse, hearing Lucien's gentle murmur, "You gave me your name, Michael. You just forgot." The worst day came about 3 months after I got home. It was mid-January. A neighbor called to say they'd seen Ranger wandering the street alone. That was impossible. I kept him inside with me, and the door was locked. Yet, sure enough, he was gone. I spent hours searching, calling his name, until I finally heard a familiar whine outside my front door. Ranger was there, shivering in the cold. His collar was missing. He walked in as if nothing had happened. At first, I was just relieved. I hugged him, feeling his fur, ignoring how he trembled. Then he looked up at me, blinking slowly. That's when I heard a faint whisper. My heart froze. The whisper came from Ranger's throat. "You gave him your name after all." I staggered backward, colliding with the doorframe. Ranger continued to stare at me with an unfocused gaze, as if seeing through me. Then he coughed, shook his head as if confused, and trotted off to his bed. I felt the air thicken, like the hush before a storm, the sense that maybe Lucien had found a new vessel to haunt me through. Since that day, I've lived with the creeping dread that I never fully escaped that cave. Maybe a piece of me stayed behind, stuck in one of those loops of time Lucien mentioned. Sometimes my reflection in the mirror is off by a fraction of a second, or I'll glance at the clock and see it spin backward for one tick. I tell myself I'm hallucinating, suffering from PTSD. But in the quiet hours, especially near midnight, I'll hear the floor creak in the next room. I'll see a shadow that doesn't match my silhouette. Ranger will stand at the door, nose pressed to the crack, whimpering at something I can't see. I've tried therapy, I've tried medication. None of it helps me shake the suspicion that Daniel's still in that cave, under Lucien's thrall, perhaps living out 1,000 loops of torment. What I did, stabbing Lucien in the neck, bought me a reprieve, but didn't end it. I don't think it ever ends. Sometimes I consider going back, trying to find the cave again, to see if I can free Daniel, or at least to confirm he's truly gone. But then the memory of that black fluid, the half-buried corpses, the way Lucien moved. It all comes rushing back, paralyzing me. I've never mustered the courage. The official story is that Daniel Reed went missing on a fall camping trip. I was severely injured and delirious when they found me. Everyone who reads the report thinks it's just another tragic hiking accident in the mountains. People vanish in wild places all the time, and sometimes their bodies are never recovered. I'm sharing this story now because there's a chance someone else might be lured to that same area, might hear the same faint voice calling their name. Maybe they'll remember my warning. If you hear a voice that sounds like a loved one, or your own, or anything that calls you by name in those woods, don't answer. Turn back. Ignore any illusions, any calls for help that come from deeper in the forest. The moment you acknowledge it, you're already trapped. If you're skeptical, I don't blame you. Before all this, I was too. That skepticism nearly cost me my life, and did cost Daniel his. The rangers never found the cave, but I know it's there, hidden under a veil of twisted time and shadow. Lucien is there waiting. As for me, I'm left with a permanent limp, a reconstructed leg that aches every time it rains, or when the temperature drops. In a sense, I got off easy. I can still walk. Some nights, though, I'll wake to find Ranger staring at me from across the room, his eyes wide, tail stiff, like he wants to bark but won't. The hair on his neck stands up, and I swear the low growl that escapes him isn't directed at me, but rather at the corner of the room behind me where I can't see. I've tried to push on with life, my freelance work, my routine, but I can't hold on to normalcy for long. I dream of the rotting supplies, the black mold creeping over everything, the flickering green flames of that impossible campfire. I see Daniel's face turn toward mine, that unnatural grin, his eyes blinking too little, his mouth shaping my name like a curse. Sometimes in the dead of night I recall how Lucien said, "We've done this many times. It always ends the same." And I wonder if I'm stuck in some loop without realizing it. If maybe I'm already dead in one version, or 100 versions, lying among those corpses in the cave. There are moments that almost convince me it was all a nightmare, but then a random glitch will happen. My phone resets to a date years in the past, or I notice the time has jumped 2 hours forward when only minutes have passed. Reality warps at the edges. I might be washing dishes and look up to see my reflection in the window, wearing different clothes than I am, or maybe having no reflection at all. It scares me more than anything. The idea that this reality is only loosely tethered, that once you've broken through some barrier, you can't unsee how fragile it is. I don't know how many times I might have died in that cave, or if a part of me is still there. All I can do is keep breathing, keep moving, and hope Lucien won't come for me again. Ranger sleeps near my bed every night now, and I keep an old iron fire poker by my side. A futile gesture, maybe, but it's the only thing that helps me feel a little safer. I dream that one night, Daniel will appear at my door, telling me he escaped. But in my dream, when I go to hug him, his flesh peels off in my arms, revealing Lucien's smiling face beneath. When I wake from those dreams, I'm drenched in sweat, my leg screaming in pain. Ranger licks my hand, whimpers softly. Then I look at the clock, which might read 3:13 or 3:33. Some nights, the minutes blink backward, and I just sit there, staring, unable to scream, because I know if I do, something might answer. So that's my story. Believe what you will. If you ever find yourself hiking near craggy gardens, listen for the wind in the trees. Watch how your campfire burns. Pay attention to your dog if you bring one. If you spot a cave entrance in the rocks, or catch a glimpse of a barefoot man with golden eyes, turn around and run. Don't wait for him to speak your name, because once he does, you'll find it echoing in your dreams forever, waiting for you to slip up and give him permission to take everything you are. I used to think the devil was just a metaphor, a symbol of temptation. But now, when I close my eyes, I see Lucien in that cave. Barefoot, calm, with Daniel kneeling at his side, both dripping black smoke from their wounds. And I hear that half-echoing voice, gentle and mocking. "We'll do this again, Michael. We'll do this forever." If the only escape was to give him my name, then I'd rather die than grant it. But in my darkest moments, I can't escape the terrible possibility that maybe I already did, and I just don't remember. 01. My name is Caleb Turner, and I was 31 years old when I decided to abandon the noise of Charlotte for a week of hiking in Lynville Gorge. This happened in August of 2023. Over the course of those nights, I learned that loneliness is sometimes the last thing you want out there. That the silent places of the world hold echoes of your worst nightmares. And now, I can't shake the sensation that parts of me are still lost in that gorge, rotting in the shadows with whatever hunts there. I made the decision to go after a painful breakup and months of feeling like my life was unraveling. My freelance illustration career was drying up. I'd stare at blank screens for hours, making half-finished sketches that never satisfied my clients or myself. My closest friends were no longer answering my calls, and my family, well, they'd never understood my obsession with solitude. I guess you could say I wanted to prove to everyone that I still had enough grit to do something truly challenging. So I packed my gear and drove up to the Lynville Gorge wilderness, a place known for steep trails, unpredictable weather, and poor cell service. It felt like the perfect recipe. No phone calls, no emails, just me and my dog Boomer. Boomer's a German shepherd, 6 years old, deeply loyal. Sometimes I swear he understands my moods better than I do. Before we left, he was always pacing around my apartment in Charlotte, whining whenever I stared too long at my sketches. When he saw me loading the car with gear, he wagged his tail and hopped in as if this trip was exactly what he'd been waiting for. That morning, the sun rose bright and clear, casting shards of gold through the pines as we drove along winding roads to the forest's edge. I had told myself this wasn't just some impulse. I'd read up on the gorge's trails. I had my topographic map, a reliable compass, a backup battery for my phone, an emergency radio, and plenty of food for both me and Boomer. I even brought a small first aid kit, water purification tablets, and 2 flashlights. I considered myself prepared, maybe not a survival expert, but certainly not naive. The only nagging thought was a piece of advice I'd read online about Lynville Gorge. Stay on established trails. The terrain can get treacherous if you wander off. But being stubborn, I thought I could handle it. I parked near an unofficial trailhead. My phone still showed 2 bars of reception, so I fired off a text to my ex, telling her I'd be gone for a while in case she needed to ship me anything I'd left. As soon as I hit send, the bars disappeared. The phone took forever to deliver the message. Then the battery icon plummeted from 100% to 10%. I remember glaring at the screen and thinking, did I buy a counterfeit battery pack? I tried not to worry about it. After all, I wanted to disconnect. I strapped on my backpack, left the phone off to preserve battery, and started hiking. The trail began innocently enough. Gnarled roots crossing the path, a few chipmunks scurrying away, and the staccato call of a woodpecker echoing from the tall trees. The air smelled fresh, tinged with damp earth. Boomer trotted ahead, ears perked, tail high. It felt good to breathe unfiltered air. For the first mile, everything was exactly as I'd hoped, quiet, peaceful. The only sign of human interference was a single worn footpath. I let my mind drift, thinking about how the next week would be. Time to sketch, time to reflect, time to become the best version of myself again. But sometime around midday, the mood shifted. A wind picked up, rustling the pines. The trail that had been straightforward now forked into 2 paths. Neither matched what my topographic map showed. In fact, the map showed a single line continuing forward, with no forks at all. I tried my compass. It pointed north, the same as always, but for some reason, the land around me seemed oriented differently than what the map said. I double-checked ridgelines, streams, and marked clearings, yet they didn't match up. At first, I figured I must have read the scale incorrectly, or maybe I'd taken a spur trail by mistake. No big deal. So I picked the path that felt right, downhill, toward the sound of distant water. If I found a creek, I could follow it and reorient. I walked for about 2 hours without finding any creek. My phone, now turned off, sat useless in my pocket. Boomer occasionally stopped, whining, ears pinned back as if he heard or sensed something. I'd kneel and give him a reassuring pat, but he'd just look at me with those intense eyes, and sometimes I thought I saw fear there. Around 3 in the afternoon, I decided to make camp. I found a relatively flat spot beneath a spread of oak trees. I set down my pack, pitched my tent, and tried to gather some wood for a fire. The forest was too silent. I'd lived in or near nature long enough to know even in the hush there should be some background noise. Birds, squirrels, something. But it was as though everything but me and my dog had vanished. Nevertheless, I managed to get a fire going. At first, it was the usual flicker of orange and red, but then the flames shifted, burning an odd bluish hue that made the shadows crawl. I tossed in more kindling, dried leaves, small twigs, nothing that would explain the odd color. Boomer paced around, whining, sniffing the air. Nightfall came quick. I fed Boomer, then ate a freeze-dried meal for myself. By the flickering firelight, I tried to sketch the tree line. I'd do a few lines, look back at the page, and realize they didn't look right. Almost as if my perspective or the shapes of the trees themselves were shifting. I gave up and went to bed. Somewhere around midnight, a strange sound woke me. It was my own voice calling out, "Boomer! Here! Boomer!" My heart hammered. The voice came from beyond the tree line. Inside the tent, I looked over to see Boomer asleep at my feet. He lifted his head, ears alert, and growled. Then I heard my voice again, repeating the same call, the same tone, as if a recording was being played back. I grabbed my flashlight. My first instinct was to unzip the tent and check, but Boomer bared his teeth at the tent flap, blocking my way. It felt unnatural to see him so protective. He's usually a gentle soul. He might bark, sure, but not like this. This was feral, a warning snarl that told me, no, don't go out there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and at first light I convinced myself it had to be some echo or a trick of the wind. Maybe I was dreaming, I told myself. But the cold sweat soaking my shirt said otherwise. Day 2 arrived with a dull ache in my back and a heavier ache in my mind. I wanted to push forward, find the official trail again. So we broke camp, packed everything up, and trudged on. The forest was dense. The map might as well have been a blank piece of paper. It no longer reflected anything real. The ravine lines, the ridge lines, all of it was off. Shortly after midday, I spotted a figure on the path ahead, sitting on a rock. Boomer tensed, but didn't growl. As I drew closer, I realized it was a man with dirty blonde hair around my age, wearing a hiking pack. He looked up at me with a sort of relieved smile and said, "Thank God." I was starting to think I was the only one out here. "Name's Eric." He extended a hand. I took it, feeling a surprising warmth in my chest at the simple fact of finding another human. He was talkative right away, explaining that he'd been out here camping for a few days too and had gotten turned around. He told me he worked in an office supply store in Boone and had taken time off to detox, as he put it. He was on edge, though. He kept glancing over his shoulder into the trees. He asked if I'd heard any weird noises at night. I hesitated, not wanting to sound like I was overreacting, but eventually I admitted I'd heard something calling out in my own voice. To my surprise, Eric didn't laugh. He just went quiet, his expression grim. "Yeah," he said. "It's not the first time I've heard something mimic voices out here, but we should stick together. This gorge, it does things to your mind." We walked side by side for a while, Eric telling me about how he'd gotten lost. He, too, had a map that didn't make sense. His phone had died inexplicably on his first night. We compared notes, realized we had no easy way to reorient. The best we could do was find the Lynville River and follow it out. But that required descending into deeper parts of the gorge. places known for sudden drop-offs and unmarked paths. The day wore on, and we didn't find the river. Eventually, we decided to camp together for safety. We settled on a small clearing near an old, twisted oak. It was obvious that Eric had set up camp before. He tossed up a tarp for extra shelter and helped me gather wood. The entire time, Boomer seemed uneasy, pacing back and forth, occasionally whining in Eric's direction. Eric noticed and tried to give the dog a treat, but Boomer refused to go near him. Night fell again, the air thick with expectation. After a cold meal, we each crawled into our tents. I tried to sleep, but around midnight I heard a rustling from Eric's tent. I peered outside with my flashlight. Eric was standing, barefoot in the moonlight, swaying a bit, his eyes half closed. He muttered words I couldn't understand. It sounded like a low chant or multiple voices layered together, but the language was nonsense. Harsh consonants, guttural sounds. I called his name quietly, no response. Boomer, by my side, let out a low growl. A half-second later, Eric turned to face me, though his eyes were still half closed. He took a step forward, then another, until he was inches from my face. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The hair on my arms stood on end. Then his eyes snapped wide open, and he jerked back with a gasp, like someone awakened from a nightmare. He apologized, claiming he must have been sleepwalking. I asked if he was okay. He just shook his head and climbed back into his tent. Neither of us mentioned it in the morning, as if acknowledging the incident might give it more power. By day 3, everything felt off balance. We tried following a ridge line, hoping to see the gorge below us. We were walking for hours when we came upon a familiar clearing. Eric cursed under his breath. It was the same spot where we'd camped the night before. The same twisted oak, the same footprint in the dirt. We had somehow looped in a circle without realizing it. The sun was too high and bright, as if it hadn't moved from its position for hours. My watch read 2 p.m., but I couldn't remember how long we'd been walking since morning. The day was stretching, warping. Then it happened. Eric's foot slipped on a slick root. He tumbled down a small embankment, hitting his head on a rock. I scrambled down, yelling his name. He was unconscious, bleeding from a small gash on his forehead. I used my first aid kit to clean the wound and bandage it. Boomer hovered nearby, whining. Eric came to a few minutes later, disoriented but able to stand with help. He said something that sounded like, "It's not me. It's not me." I tried to ask him what he meant, but he just stared at the ground, silent and shaking. Eventually, he claimed he'd lost track of how many days he'd been out here. We both had. We decided to make camp early so Eric could rest and recover. I placed my tent closer to his, just in case he needed help during the night. We had a quiet dinner. Eric seemed listless, barely answering my questions, as if his mind was somewhere else. I told him about the odd footprints, the weird voices. He finally spoke up. "I've experienced it too. The forest is messing with us. There's something out here that mimics." He paused, rubbing the bandage on his forehead. "I was told, or read, or maybe dreamt about an entity that can shapeshift. They call it skinwalker, or something like that, but I didn't think it was real." He trailed off. "We have to leave, Caleb." I tried to reassure him, but I wasn't sure how. My own fear was raw, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. That night, I dozed off for maybe an hour before Boomer's frantic barking jolted me awake. I scrabbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent. Eric was gone. His tent flap was wide open, his sleeping bag strewn across the dirt. Boomer bolted into the darkness, barking, so I raced after him. Moonlight lit the clearing in a harsh silver glow. Beyond the twisted oak, I saw a shape moving among the trees. I followed, yelling Eric's name. Boomer led me deeper into the forest, my heart pounding. The ground was uneven and branches snapped under my boots. Eventually, I found Eric's backpack abandoned near a dried-up creek bed. But no sign of Eric. The forest was so silent my pulse in my ears sounded like thunder. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice. "Caleb, help me." I turned. The voice was quiet, but it was Eric's. Or at least it sounded like him. I shone my flashlight in a slow arc across the trees. Nothing. I shouted, "Eric, where are you?" No response, just a faint breeze rustling dead leaves. An awful thought crept in. It might be that thing, the thing that mimics. At that point, I decided I couldn't navigate in the dark. I had to get back, wait till morning, and keep searching at first light. So I whistled for Boomer and hurried back to camp. Adrenaline left me shaking, tears prickling my eyes. I felt powerless. Morning came with no sign of Eric. My entire body ached from stress and exhaustion. I broke camp mechanically, pushing down the panic. If Eric was out there, maybe he'd find his way back. But some part of me doubted it. I spent the day searching for him, combing through dense vegetation, calling his name. Boomer sometimes picked up a scent trail, but then we'd lose it. Around midday, I found a single boot print that looked fresh. I followed it to a shallow cave near a slope covered in rhododendrons. Inside the cave, the walls were coated in soot or charcoal. By the thin sunlight filtering in, I could make out drawings. Crude, childlike sketches. My chest tightened when I recognized the shape of a dog that looked eerily like Boomer. Next to it was a stick figure with features resembling me. A short beard, a baseball cap. The lines were smeared, frantic, and in one corner I spotted Eric's face with a deep slash across it. Animal bones littered the floor, some small, some larger. My flashlight caught the gleam of something metallic in a corner. I cautiously crept over, only to find a torn piece of Eric's shirt along with a battered canteen. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The beam of my flashlight flickered as my hand shook. I felt watched. My breath caught in my throat and I spun around, half expecting to see a shape behind me. Nothing. Just Boomer, pressed against my leg, trembling and whimpering softly. I backed out of that cave, never taking my eyes off the interior. Once in daylight, I took a few seconds to calm my ragged breathing. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp again, exhausted and on the edge of losing hope. My supplies were diminishing faster than I'd planned. The protein bars and freeze-dried meals that were supposed to last the entire week seemed spoiled. When I opened one, the smell was rancid. Green fuzz clung to the edges. This made no sense. Freeze-dried food doesn't rot that quickly. But the entire bag of them was ruined. Boomer's dog food was a soggy mess, like it had been left in the rain for days, though the weather was dry. I ended up foraging for edible plants, rummaging for anything salvageable. Anxiety gnawed at me as the sun sank behind the distant ridgelines. That evening, I built another fire. It flared blue again, casting warped shadows across the forest floor. My water supply had a stale metallic taste that set my teeth on edge. My watch read 8 p.m., but the sky looked more like twilight than night. Time was behaving strangely. The forest felt timeless, as if day and night were illusions meant to confuse me. When I finally got into my tent, I tossed and turned for hours, drifting into a half-sleep. Then, something yanked me awake, a snapping twig, a rustle of movement. I froze. Boomer was growling deep in his throat. Through the thin fabric of the tent, I saw the silhouette of a person standing just a few feet away. The figure didn't move, but I heard shallow breathing. My first thought was Eric, so I called out softly, "Eric, is that you?" No answer. The silhouette slowly leaned closer to the tent as if to peer inside. A strangled gasp caught in my throat. I fumbled for my knife. Suddenly, the figure stepped back. A voice that sounded like Eric's said, "I've always been here." The words were mechanical, lacking emotion. Then it turned and walked off, the footfalls disappearing into the trees. Boomer lunged at the tent flap, but by the time I unzipped it, the shape was gone. I felt a chill run along my spine, fear mixing with heartbreak. If that really was Eric, he was changed somehow. If it wasn't Eric, then something else was out there, using his voice to toy with me. By dawn of day 5, at least what I perceived as day 5, my mental state was fraying. Boomer and I pushed onward, certain we had to find a real trail or the river. We walked for what felt like half the day until we stumbled upon a small stream. Relief washed over me, thinking we could follow the flow to the gorge. I filled my canteen, purified the water, and let Boomer drink. That's when I heard barking ahead. 2 different barks that sounded exactly like Boomer's. My dog pricked his ears, looking confused. He barked once, and in reply, 2 identical barks echoed from beyond a rocky outcrop. My pulse pounded. This was the same mimicry I'd heard with my own voice before. Now it was mocking my dog. I whispered to Boomer, trying to keep him calm. Suddenly, he bolted, ignoring my commands. I chased after him, slipping on wet stones. I rounded a bend in the stream, and that's when I saw him. The silhouette of a man crouched over Boomer, who was lying still on the ground. "Boomer!" I shouted, adrenaline surging. As I scrambled closer, the man turned. It looked like Eric, but not quite. His eyes were too wide, his smile too stretched. Blood stained his fingertips. He gazed at me with an unnatural calm. "He wouldn't come with me," he said in a voice that crackled, as if layering multiple tones. A wave of horror threatened to buckle my knees. Boomer whimpered. I saw a deep gash along his flank, blood pooling under him. My dog was alive but badly hurt. Fury overrode my terror. I had a small hunting knife in my belt, and I drew it without thinking. Eric, or what looked like him, stood upright, still smiling. The creature's eyes flicked to the knife. "It's not me," he whispered. "I've always been here." He lunged at me with shocking speed. I managed to dodge, slashing wildly. My blade connected with flesh. I felt resistance, then a hot spray across my hand. A shriek tore from his throat, so human and yet layered with something monstrous. He staggered back, clutching a deep cut in his side. For a split second, his face flickered like an image losing focus, and his features shifted. Something in my mind registered that I wasn't fighting Eric at all. I was fighting something else, wearing his skin like a poorly fitted costume. It let out a ragged gasp, eyes bulging in fury, then lunged again, this time with a hatchet I hadn't noticed before. I barely threw myself to the side in time. Boomer let out a weak bark, which gave me the burst of courage I needed. I drove the knife upward as the creature overextended. The blade sank into its torso. It let out an unearthly wail, an impossible blend of Eric's voice and a high-pitched shriek. I wrenched the knife free and the thing dropped to its knees. I didn't wait around to see if it would get back up. I scooped Boomer into my arms and ran, ignoring the tears of pain in my shoulder. My dog's blood soaked through my clothes. Branches slapped at my face as I barreled through the undergrowth, expecting any second to feel that hatchet bite into my back. Somehow, I found a flat stretch of ground and set Boomer down carefully. He was panting, his eyes glazed. I managed to wrap a makeshift bandage around his flank. The wound was nasty, but maybe not fatal if I could get him medical attention soon. I had no idea how far I was from help. We kept moving. My mind raced with fragments of thought. That wasn't Eric. It's messing with us. Time's all wrong. We have to get out. I forced myself to push forward, ignoring the searing pain in my thighs and the stinging branches tearing at my arms. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and to my utter shock, I saw a structure, what looked like a small, weathered ranger station. This made no sense. I should have seen it on my map, but I didn't question it. I stumbled toward the building, half laughing in disbelief, half sobbing from exhaustion and fear. My watch read 6 p.m., though the sun was still high. It felt more like midday. I knocked on the door, which swung open to reveal a single cramped room with a dusty desk, some radio equipment, and posters of local wildlife. A tall man with a salt and pepper beard stared at me, wide-eyed, as I stumbled in carrying my bleeding dog. "Jesus," he exclaimed. "What happened to you, son?" He set down a mug of coffee and helped me lower Boomer onto a blanket on the floor. "We need to get you out of here." I babbled something about being lost for days, about my friend missing, about a monster wearing his face. The ranger's eyes flicked to my dog's wound. He shook his head, grabbed a field kit, and started applying pressure. Another ranger, a younger woman, hurried in from a back room to assist, calling for an ambulance over the radio. After they stabilized Boomer as best they could, the older ranger guided me to a chair and offered me water. "We've been searching for a lost hiker these past 2 days. Name's Eric Madsen, from Boone. But you say he's your friend." I nodded, tears burning in my eyes. "Yeah, we met out here. We got separated." He pressed on. "You've only been out here a couple days, right? Left your car near the Kistler Memorial Highway, from what we gathered." I looked at him, completely confused. "A couple days? This is day 5 or 6. I can't remember." He and the younger ranger exchanged a glance. The older one said, "Kid, your ex called local authorities when you missed a scheduled check-in last week. You've been gone for nearly 2 weeks." My brain reeled. That was impossible. I tried to piece the timeline together. We left on what I believed to be August 14th, so by my count I should only have been out here. My watch read August 17th, but the older ranger insisted it was the 26th. I felt nauseous. That can't be. My watch says. I looked down and saw the hands spinning slowly in reverse. My skin prickled cold. At that moment, the younger ranger approached with a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You're safe now. Just rest. We'll get Boomer to a vet as soon as we can." I nodded shakily, leaning back against the wall. Exhaustion overcame me. I drifted into a half-unconscious state, memories swirling. Eric's strange stare, the cave with the drawings, the stench of rotting food, the look in the creature's eyes as I stabbed it. Maybe now it was over. Maybe we'd made it out. I woke to an empty room. The lights were off except for a dim emergency bulb. The clock on the wall said 1 a.m., but I had no idea which day. Boomer was gone. My panic returned tenfold. I staggered to my feet, calling his name. No answer. The station was eerily silent. I found the younger ranger in the back room alone, leaning against a bunk. She said calmly, "They took your dog to a 24-hour clinic in Asheville." Relief and anxiety tangled in my chest. "What about the older ranger? When are we leaving?" She didn't answer my question. Instead, she said, "You've been gone a long time, Caleb." Her voice was strangely flat. I realized her eyes weren't blinking. Her lips curled into a slow smile that stretched too wide. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Without warning, she repeated, "I've always been here," in that same layered tone I'd heard before. My stomach lurched. It's not over, I thought. The thing followed me. I turned to run, but the door to the main room slammed shut. The flickering overhead light revealed that her hands were contorting into a shape that didn't look fully human. Her fingers elongated, nails blackening. I had no weapon, nothing but my bare fists. Desperate, I shoved past her, ignoring the burning pain of claws scraping my shoulder. I rammed the door with my shoulder until it burst open. Racing into the main room, I tripped over something. My pack. I fumbled inside, found my hunting knife. The younger ranger, if that's what she'd been, emerged from the back. Her body seemed to ripple under the uniform, as if something inside was trying to break free. I pointed the knife at her, voice shaking. "Where's Boomer? Where's the real ranger?" She laughed, a hideous blend of high and low pitches. "You gave me quite a chase," she, or it, crooned. "Took a chunk out of me, yes, but you can't stop what's always been here." She lunged, unnatural speed closing the distance in a heartbeat. I slashed wildly. Warm fluid spattered across my face and she shrieked, staggering back. For a second, her form flickered, like a glitch in reality. She was no longer the ranger at all, but a tall, lanky figure with skin pulled tight across its skull, eyes too large, mouth dripping black saliva. It was hunched, skeletal, and horrific. I realized with creeping terror that this was the same being I'd injured in the forest, the same slash in its side, now sealed with black, crusted blood. It bared elongated teeth in a furious snarl. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could, a flare gun mounted on the station wall. I fired it at the creature's chest. The projectile slammed into it, igniting a red glare that lit the room like a demonic sunrise. The creature screeched, thrashing in agony. The smell of burning flesh made me gag, but I didn't wait for it to recover. I snatched the station's front door handle, yanked it open, and sprinted out into the night. The black sky was filled with swirling clouds, or maybe smoke from the creature's burning wound. I had no idea where I was going. The forest seemed to stretch in every direction. A single track of footprints led away from the station, but when I looked closely, they were mine, leading in a circle around the building. Panic flared. Had the creature manipulated everything again, or was I losing my mind? I heard the station door slam behind me. A shrieking, rasping cough followed. Summoning my last reserves of willpower, I stumbled into the trees, heading for a faint glow that might have been moonlight. The forest felt alive, branches clawing at me like skeletal hands, the ground pulsing with each step. My lungs burned. My heart battered my ribs. Somehow, I made it down a slope, tripped, and rolled into a patch of thorns. I must have been delirious from pain and exhaustion because everything blurred. I remember smelling blood and hearing my own ragged gasps. When I came to, I was on a gravel road. Headlights blinded me. The squeal of brakes. Voices shouting, "Are you okay? Holy crap, man!" A man in a park ranger uniform jumped out of a truck. He looked entirely human, normal. Another figure got out from the passenger side, a rescue volunteer maybe. They helped me into the truck, asked what had happened. I was too out of breath, too stunned to answer coherently. The ranger explained they'd found me lying on the side of the service road near the Short-Off Trail, half a mile from a small ranger outpost that had been abandoned for years. I choked out, "Where's Boomer?" They stared at me blankly. The volunteer asked, "Who?" My mind reeled. I insisted I had a dog with me. They exchanged wary glances, gently telling me they'd found no sign of a dog, no signs of anyone else. I argued, nearly screaming, but the exhaustion overcame me. I blacked out again. The next piece I remember is waking in a hospital in Marion. A doctor was checking my IV. A local deputy was at my bedside saying they were investigating the whereabouts of Eric Madsen. They asked if I had any information. I told them the whole story, tearing up at times, describing how Eric had vanished, how we'd been hunted by something. They gave me polite but uneasy nods, clearly not believing me. One of the nurses whispered that it was a miracle I survived so long in the gorge alone. I was in the hospital for 3 days. They treated me for dehydration, shock, and multiple lacerations. Once I was well enough to leave, I demanded to see Boomer, or at least find out where he'd been taken. The staff looked at me with pity and confusion. Nobody had any record of an injured dog being brought in. When I finally got access to my personal effects, I found my phone. Battery drained, the date and time reset to factory defaults. My sleeping bag was in the pile of gear, the zipper torn at the top. My backpack contained my sketches, but the pages were blank, as if the pencil marks had been erased or never existed. Worst of all, Boomer's leash was gone. Not even a collar or a dog bowl. It was as if I'd never brought him in the first place. The ranger who'd found me stopped by once more before I left. He told me to focus on recovery, that the gorge can be disorienting, that people often imagine things when they're in survival mode for too long, but I saw doubt in his eyes. I tried to tell him about the occupant of the outpost station, the monstrous figure. He just shook his head. That station's been out of commission for over a decade, he said quietly. No one's been there for years. I said nothing else. By that point, I understood no one would believe me. I left the hospital wearing borrowed clothes. The authorities offered me a ride back to the main trailhead where I'd parked, to collect my car. As we wound along the roads, I asked the deputy if they'd found a campsite with my tent or supplies. He shrugged. Search party combed a decent radius around that area. Didn't find anything except some abandoned scraps of gear that looked old, like they'd been out there for a decade or more. I sank into my seat, heart heavy with a profound sense of loss. Where was Boomer? What had really happened to Eric? What had I been fighting in that forest? The car arrived at the parking area. My battered sedan was still there, covered in pine needles, dust, and leaves. I thanked the deputy and drove away, forcing myself not to look in the rearview mirror too often. Every time I glanced, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the back seat, just a shadow, or maybe wishful thinking. Could it have been Boomer or something else? For weeks, I tried to piece together the events. I scoured news reports for any sign of Eric Madsen. He was still listed as missing. Nobody else claimed to have encountered the creature. A handful of conspiracy theories popped up online, but nothing substantial. My parents tried to coax me into therapy, which I did, but explaining the story only seemed to make me sound insane. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if some kind of psychotic break or mass hallucination had taken place. But at night, I still dream of that clearing, the blue flames, and the swirl of voices calling out in my own tone, calling Boomer's bark, calling Eric's name. Sometimes I wake up expecting to see Boomer curled up at my feet, but my apartment is silent. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I think I see a tall, lanky figure with two wide eyes, smiling just a little too long. I keep my curtains drawn these days. I don't answer unknown calls. The wind howling outside my window makes me jump. There's a part of me that fears the creature is still out there, that it might wander into my life again. Another part of me worries that I never truly escaped, that maybe I'm stuck in some corner of that forest, hallucinating all of this. A month after my return, I made a final attempt at closure. I drove back toward Lynville Gorge, parking near a different trailhead. But I couldn't bring myself to set foot on the trails. My legs locked up, and I felt a raw terror in my gut. Instead, I left a dog collar near the entrance with a small note. Boomer, I'm sorry. I placed a handful of dog treats by it. On my drive home, I caught sight of something in the passenger seat. A single paw print in the dust. My heart stuttered, but when I glanced again, it was gone. I don't know if I believe in curses, or shape-shifting entities, or living nightmares. But I do know that something out there in Lynville Gorge echoes the voices of the lost. It mimics the forms of those it takes, twisting time and warping reality around it. Sometimes I wonder if it's lonely in that deep wilderness, or if it finds satisfaction in wearing the memories and faces of its victims. As for me, I'm left with the haunting possibility that I'll never see my dog again, never have answers about Eric, or closure about the horrors we encountered. Some nights, I awake to the sound of scratching at my door, or a faint bark that reminds me of Boomer. I can't bring myself to check, because if I opened that door and saw him there, tail wagging, with that too wide smile, I don't think I'd survive it. It's been weeks now. Every morning I check my phone's calendar, half expecting the dates to have changed or reversed. I keep an analog clock on my nightstand, ensuring it's ticking forward. I do my best to convince myself that I'm safe, that time is moving normally. But in quiet moments I sense a whisper at the edge of my hearing. "Caleb, here, Boomer." I pray it's just my imagination, because if it's not, if that forest has followed me home, then I'm not sure there's anywhere left to run.